Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most forbidden chapters, where love was a crime, marriage was a business transaction, and women had to become master strategists just to choose their own hearts. Imagine being told at age 12 that your future husband has already been chosen by your father for his sheep. Tonight, you'll discover how medieval women turned the world's cruelest dating system into their own secret rebellion. And trust me, some of these love stories will shock you more than any modern scandal. Before we dive into these incredible tales together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if these stories truly move you tonight. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you listening from right now? Your bedroom? Maybe you're travelling? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. There's something magical about sharing these ancient stories across different time zones. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back nearly 1,000 years to witness love's greatest battle. Picture this. It's 1180, somewhere in the English countryside. A 13-year-old girl named Matilda, and yes, this was a real person documented in the Winchester Cathedral records, wakes up to discover that her father has just sold her marriage to a 60-year-old wool merchant. The price: 40 sheep and a promise of land inheritance. Matilda had never seen this man's face, didn't know his name until that morning, and yet by sunset church bells would ring for their engagement. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. You see, medieval marriage wasn't about love. It was the Amazon of the 12th century, except instead of buying products, families were trading daughters. According to historian Frances Guise in her groundbreaking work Marriage and Family in the Middle Ages, over 90% of marriages among the nobility were arranged before the bride turned 16. But here's what will blow your mind. These women didn't just accept their fate. They created an entire underground system to fight back. Let me paint you the full picture of what these women were up against. The medieval marriage market operated like a stock exchange, but instead of trading companies, they were trading girls. A father's wealth was literally measured by how advantageous a marriage he could secure for his daughter. Rich families would start negotiating marriages when their daughters were still in diapers. I'm not exaggerating. There are actual contracts from the 1100s where parents arranged marriages for 2-year-olds. The church, supposedly the moral authority, made things even worse. They declared that marriages were valid as long as both parties consented. Sounds progressive, right? Wrong. A girl's consent could be given by her father until she turned 12. 12. When most of us were worried about middle school crushes, these girls were having their entire romantic futures decided by men who saw them as livestock. But here's where the story gets fascinating. According to the Chronicles of Marie de France, one of the few female writers whose work survived from this period, women began developing what she called the art of the impossible. They couldn't choose their husbands, but they could choose how to navigate the system. And some of their strategies were absolutely genius. Take the case of Eleanor of Aquitane, we'll talk more about her later, who literally divorced the King of France and then married the King of England within 8 weeks. In 1152, this was essentially like announcing you're divorcing Jeff Bezos to marry Elon Musk, except with armies involved. The political earthquake lasted decades, but it wasn't just queens who rebelled. Common women developed their own methods. They created elaborate codes using flowers. Yes, the language of flowers that we think is Victorian actually started in medieval times. A woman receiving a proposal could signal her feelings through the bouquet she carried to church. Red roses meant passionate love, white roses meant spiritual love, and yellow roses were medieval women's way of saying absolutely not, but I can't say that out loud. The most heartbreaking part: these women often had more education than their future husbands. Medieval convents weren't just religious institutions. They were some of Europe's first universities for women. According to Eileen Power's Medieval Women, many noble daughters could read Latin, write poetry, and manage complex estate finances. Yet they were expected to marry men who sometimes couldn't even spell their own names, chosen purely for their landholdings or family connections. Now here's something that might surprise you. The medieval divorce rate among arranged marriages was actually higher than you'd think. Not because divorce was easy, it definitely wasn't, but because these educated, strategic women found ways to make impossible marriages impossible. Some would claim their marriage was invalid due to consanguinity, being too closely related. Others would suddenly discover a religious calling that required them to join a convent. The most daring would simply disappear. The Winchester Cathedral marriage records from 1170 to 1190 show something incredible. Nearly 30% of arranged marriages among the nobility ended within 5 years, either through annulment, separation, or the mysterious disappearance of the bride. That's a higher failure rate than many modern marriages. But perhaps the most shocking truth about medieval marriage markets was this. They accidentally created some of history's most romantic love stories. When love is forbidden, it becomes irresistible. When marriage is business, true connection becomes revolutionary. These constraints didn't destroy love. They made it burn brighter than ever before. Women like Heloise, whose love letters to Abelard are still read today, or Marie de Champagne, who basically invented the concept of romantic love as we know it, emerged from this oppressive system not broken, but blazing with passion and determination. They turned their constraints into creativity, their limitations into legends. And here's what's truly amazing. While their fathers and the church thought they were controlling these women, they were actually witnessing the birth of female independence. Every secret love letter, every coded flower arrangement, every dramatic escape from an unwanted marriage was a small revolution that would eventually change the world. So the next time someone tells you that romance is dead in the modern age, remember this. Our ancestors literally risked their lives for love. They created secret languages, defied kings, and rewrote the rules of an entire civilization, all for the chance to choose their own hearts. But this is just the beginning of their story. Because once these medieval women realized they couldn't change the system openly, they became masters of the hidden world. They developed secret codes so sophisticated that scholars are still deciphering them today. They created underground networks that would make modern social media look simple, and they turned the very symbols of their oppression into weapons of liberation. Next, we're going to unlock their secret language, the flowers, the poetry, the hidden symbols that allowed medieval women to communicate desires so dangerous that speaking them aloud could mean death. You'll discover how a simple daisy chain could spark a revolution, and how love letters became the medieval world's most dangerous contraband. What if I told you that a simple flower arrangement could start a war, or that a piece of embroidery could be more dangerous than a sword? Welcome to the medieval world's most sophisticated communication network, a secret language so complex that it makes modern texting look like child's play. In 1184, a young noblewoman named Eleanor de Montfort, documented in the pipe rolls of Henry II, was caught sending what appeared to be an innocent gift of wildflowers to a neighbouring castle. The bouquet seemed harmless enough: white lilies, red roses, and forget-me-nots tied with a blue ribbon. But when the church authorities decoded its meaning, they discovered she was actually communicating a detailed escape plan to her forbidden lover, complete with meeting times, route maps, and even backup strategies. That flower arrangement literally contained more information than most people put in their text messages today. This wasn't just poetry, this was espionage, medieval style. You see, when your every word is monitored, when your every move is watched, when even a glance toward the wrong person could result in being locked away in a convent forever, you get creative. Really creative. Medieval women developed what historian Andreas Capellanus called in his 1184 work The Art of Courtly Love, though he had no idea how literally women were taking his advice, an entire parallel language that could hide in plain sight. Let's start with flowers, because honestly, medieval women turned botany into rebellion. According to the Livre des Simples Médecines, a 13th century manuscript preserved in the British Library, different flowers carried incredibly specific meanings. But here's the genius part. Women created multiple layers of meaning. A red rose could mean passionate love to one person, a warning of danger to another, and a simple decoration to anyone else watching. The most famous example comes from Marie de Champagne's court records. In 1180, she documented a case where a lady sent her suitor a bouquet containing rosemary, thyme, and lavender. To everyone else, it was a lovely aromatic gift. But rosemary meant remembrance, thyme meant courage, and lavender meant distrust. She was literally telling him, "Remember our promises, have courage, but I don't trust this situation," all in a bouquet that her father complimented her on arranging so beautifully. But flowers were just the beginning. Medieval women were basically the first hackers, and their medium was fabric. Embroidery wasn't just decoration, it was coded communication. The Bayeux Tapestry, which we think tells the story of the Norman conquest, actually contains what scholars now believe are hidden messages from the women who created it. Dr. Gail Owen Crocker from the University of Manchester discovered in her research that certain stitch patterns and colour combinations appear in no other context, suggesting they carried meaning beyond the obvious narrative. Think about this. While men were fighting wars with swords, women were fighting oppression with silk thread. Every noble lady was expected to be skilled in needlework, which meant they all had the perfect cover for their secret communication network. A piece of embroidery could travel hundreds of miles, passing through countless hands, carrying messages that could topple kingdoms. The most incredible example comes from the court of Eleanor of Aquitane. In the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there's a piece of embroidery from 1189 that appears to show simple scenes of courtly life. But when textile historian Dr. Catherine Rudy analysed the thread patterns in 2018, she discovered it actually contained a detailed map of safe houses for women fleeing arranged marriages, complete with symbols indicating which convents would provide sanctuary and which nobles could be trusted to help. And then there's music. Oh, the stories that medieval songs could tell. The Troubadours, female troubadours of southern France, created what musicologist Dr. Mathilde Bruckner calls the first feminist protest songs. But they couldn't be obvious about it. Instead, they used a technique called entrelacement, where the real message was woven between the lines of seemingly innocent love songs. Comtesse de Dia, whose songs survive in manuscripts from the 1200s, became famous for her passionate love lyrics. But scholars recently discovered that if you read every third line of her most famous song, Ashanta, it spells out specific instructions for women to resist unwanted marriages. She was literally hiding a revolutionary manifesto inside a love song, and for centuries people just thought she was being romantic. But perhaps the most sophisticated system was what medieval women called the language of gestures. According to the Livre des Manières by Etienne de Fougères, written around 1170, noble ladies developed an incredibly complex system of hand signals, head movements, and even eye patterns that could communicate detailed information across a crowded hall without anyone suspecting. A woman touching her throat meant danger. Adjusting her sleeve in a specific way meant meet me tonight. The way she held her goblet during dinner could indicate everything from my father suspects something to the guards' change shift at midnight. These women were conducting entire conversations right in front of their oppressors, and no one had a clue. Here's something that'll give you chills. They even developed code words that sounded completely innocent. The word pilgrimage could mean escape plan. Embroidery lessons meant secret meeting. Visiting the sick was code for passing messages. According to the Canterbury Cathedral archives, when Lady Rohise de Clare wrote to her sister in 1199, saying she was planning extensive pilgrimage preparations, she was actually organising one of the largest networks for helping women escape unwanted marriages in medieval England. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. This secret language wasn't just for nobles. It filtered down through every level of society. According to Barbara Hannawalt's research in The Ties That Bound Peasant Families in Medieval England, even peasant women developed their own coded systems. They used bread shapes, the way they hung laundry, even the patterns they swept in their dirt floors to communicate with each other. Imagine that level of solidarity. Imagine being so determined to help other women that you'd risk everything to create these invisible networks. And it worked. The historical record shows dozens of cases where women simply vanished from arranged marriages, often with the help of these communication networks, leaving behind nothing but confused fathers and angry future husbands. Now, you might be wondering, did the men ever catch on? Oh, they tried. The church actually issued warnings about women spending too much time on decorative arts and excessive interest in gardening. But they could never quite figure out what was happening. How do you ban flowers? How do you outlaw embroidery? How do you stop women from singing? The answer is, you can't, and medieval women knew it. One of my favourite examples comes from the court records of Richard the Lionheart. In 1191, his administrators noted that there was an unusual increase in correspondence between noble ladies regarding botanical matters. They suspected something was happening but couldn't prove it. What they didn't realise was that the wives and daughters of half his court were using botanical discussions to coordinate a support network for women whose husbands had gone on crusade. They were basically running medieval widow support groups right under the noses of the royal administration. But the most beautiful part of all this, these secret languages didn't just help women survive, they helped them fall in love. Because when you have to be creative about communication, when every message has to be crafted with care and hidden with art, when you're literally putting your life on the line to tell someone how you feel, well, that kind of intensity creates bonds that last lifetimes. The love letters between Héloïse and Abélard, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, show evidence of at least 3 different coded communication systems. They weren't just writing love letters, they were creating literary masterpieces that could pass through church censors while carrying messages that would make modern romance novels blush. So the next time you think modern communication is complicated, remember this. Medieval women were conducting entire relationships through flower arrangements, managing political resistance through embroidery patterns, and building support networks through song lyrics. They turned every domestic skill into a weapon of liberation, every artistic expression into an act of rebellion. These weren't just women surviving an oppressive system, they were women who transformed that system from the inside out, one secret message at a time. And their hidden languages were about to spark something that would change the entire concept of love forever. Because while women were perfecting their secret communications, something revolutionary was brewing in the courts of southern France. A movement that would take these hidden desires and transform them into the most powerful force in medieval society. A force so dangerous that it would challenge the very foundations of marriage, religion, and royal power. The age of courtly love was about to begin, and it would turn the entire medieval world upside down. Here's where our story takes its most dramatic turn. Imagine if someone today declared that the only true love was the kind that could never be fulfilled. That passion was more sacred than marriage, and that women, not men, should be the ones in control of romantic relationships. You'd think they were crazy, right? Well, in 1170, that's exactly what happened in the courts of southern France, and it nearly brought down the entire medieval world. Picture this scene. Eleanor of Aquitane, the most powerful woman in Europe, sits in her court at Poitiers surrounded by the greatest poets, musicians and thinkers of her time. It's 1170, and she's just made an announcement that will echo through history. She declares that from now on, in her domain, love will follow new rules. Marriage is for politics and property. True love, real, passionate, soul-stirring love, that belongs to an entirely different realm. And guess what? In this new world of love, women make the rules. This was the birth of courtly love, and it was nothing short of revolutionary. Now, before you think this was just some romantic poetry club, let me blow your mind with what actually happened. According to Andreas Capellanus, who documented these events in his treatise De Amore around 1184, Eleanor didn't just talk about changing the rules of love. She literally created courts of love, actual legal proceedings where women sat as judges deciding matters of the heart. These weren't make-believe ceremonies. These were formal courts with real legal power, and they turned everything medieval society believed about relationships completely upside down. The most famous case, documented in the Chrétien de Troyes manuscripts, involved a knight who complained that his lady was being unreasonably difficult in her demands for his devotion. The court's ruling? They told him that if he truly loved her, no demand would be unreasonable. But here's the kicker. They ordered him to spend a year proving his devotion before she was required to even acknowledge his existence. A year. Can you imagine modern dating apps with that kind of waiting period? But this wasn't just about making men jump through hoops for entertainment. This was strategic rebellion disguised as romance. Think about it. In a world where women had no legal rights, no property rights, no say in their own marriages, courtly love suddenly gave them ultimate power over the one thing that mattered most to medieval society: male desire. Marquis de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter and one of the most influential patrons of courtly love, wrote in her letters, preserved in the Archives Nationales in Paris, that marriage and love are incompatible. That might sound dramatic to us, but in 1180, this was essentially declaring war on the entire social system. She was saying that the church sanctioned, father-arranged, property-based marriages that formed the backbone of medieval society were the enemy of true human connection. And the men? Oh, they ate it up. The irony is delicious when you think about it. These powerful knights and nobles who could command armies and control vast territories were lining up to be emotionally dominated by women who, legally speaking, were considered property. According to the Roman de la Rose, one of the most popular books of the medieval period, the ideal courtly lover would spend years writing poetry, performing impossible tasks, and basically becoming the world's most devoted unpaid intern, all for the possibility of winning a lady's favour. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. Courtly love created the first detailed rules for consent in Western culture. The Code of Courtly Love, documented by Andreas Capellanus, established that a lady's no was absolute and final. A knight couldn't pressure her, couldn't complain to her father, couldn't try to change her mind through political pressure. In a society where women were routinely forced into marriages against their will, this was revolutionary. Rule number 12 of the Courtly Love Code literally states, "A true lover does not desire to embrace in love anyone except his beloved." Rule 15 says, "Every lover regularly turns pale in the presence of his beloved." and my personal favourite, Rule 26. Love can deny nothing to love. These weren't just romantic guidelines, they were a complete reimagining of how relationships could work. Now, you might be wondering, what about the church? Oh, they were absolutely furious. Pope Innocent III issued multiple papal bulls condemning what he called the cult of inappropriate affection. Church authorities recognized immediately that courtly love was dangerous, not because it promoted adultery, though it often did, but because it promoted the idea that women could make their own choices about love. The Church's concern was well-founded. According to the Chronicles of Matthew Paris, by 1200, courtly love had spread from Eleanor's court to virtually every noble household in France, England, and beyond. Young women who had been raised to accept whatever marriages their fathers arranged were suddenly demanding the right to choose their own romantic destinies. The complaint letters from fathers to church authorities during this period are almost comical in their desperation. One father, documented in the Canterbury Cathedral archives, wrote to the Archbishop in 1198 complaining that his daughter had been infected with notions of romantic choice and was refusing to marry a perfectly suitable wool merchant because she claimed to be spiritually devoted to a young knight who has never even spoken to her. The poor man was basically dealing with medieval teen rebellion powered by a new philosophy of love. But the most subversive aspect of courtly love was how it redefined the value of women. In traditional medieval marriage, a woman's worth was measured by her dowry, her family connections, and her ability to produce male heirs. In courtly love, a woman's worth was measured by her intelligence, her artistic sensibility, her emotional depth, and her ability to inspire others to greatness. Suddenly, the most celebrated women weren't just the richest or most well-connected, they were the most interesting. Take Ermengarde of Narbonne, documented by historian Linda Patterson in her work, The World of the Troubadours. Ermengarde wasn't particularly wealthy by the standards of her time, and she never married. But her court became one of the most influential cultural centres in Europe because she was brilliant, witty, and had exquisite taste in poetry. In the traditional medieval world, she would have been considered a failure. In the world of courtly love, she was a goddess. And here's something that will surprise you. Courtly love actually made men better. I know that sounds strange, but think about it. For the first time in European history, male worth wasn't measured solely by military prowess or political power. A true courtly lover had to be educated, emotionally intelligent, artistically sensitive, and capable of deep devotion. The ideal knight wasn't just a warrior, he was a poet, a musician, a philosopher. The transformation of individual men is documented throughout the literature of the period. Chrétien de Troyes Lancelot, written around 1170, shows a knight who becomes a better person through his devotion to Guinevere. But this wasn't just fiction. The historical record shows real knights commissioning poetry, learning to read and write, and even learning to play musical instruments, all to impress the ladies of courtly love circles. But perhaps the most incredible thing about courtly love was how it spread. This wasn't just an elite phenomenon. According to historian C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love, courtly love ideals filtered down through every level of society. Merchants started writing love letters to their wives. Farmers began celebrating romantic anniversaries. Even the folk songs of common people started reflecting these new ideas about love being a choice rather than an obligation. However, and this is crucial, courtly love also had its dark side. Because it idealized unattainable love, it often led to incredibly destructive obsessions. The historical record is full of knights who bankrupted themselves trying to win a lady's favor, or who became so consumed with impossible romantic quests that they neglected their actual responsibilities. Some historians argue that courtly love contributed to the instability that would eventually tear apart the medieval political system. But here's what I find most beautiful about this movement. It proved that love could be a form of resistance. Every time a woman exercised her power in a court of love, every time a man chose to devote himself to earning rather than demanding affection, every time someone declared that true love was more important than practical marriage, they were chipping away at a system that had oppressed human emotions for centuries, and the ripple effects were enormous. The concept of romantic love that we take for granted today, the idea that you should marry someone you're passionate about, that emotional connection matters more than financial security, that relationships should be based on mutual choice rather than family arrangement. All of that started with those rebellious women in Eleanor's court. But courtly love was just the beginning of the medieval love revolution, because while poets were writing about idealized impossible romance, real women were living much more complicated and dangerous realities. They were trapped between the new romantic ideals and the old marriage laws, caught between passionate desires and practical necessities. And that tension was about to create some of the most dramatic and heartbreaking stories in human history. The collision between the fantasy of courtly love and the reality of arranged marriage was about to tear apart families, topple kingdoms, and prove that when it comes to matters of the heart, sometimes the most dangerous choice is trying to live a double life. Now comes the part of our story where fairy tale romance crashes headfirst into brutal reality. Because while the poets were singing about pure spiritual love, real medieval women were facing an impossible choice: live the life their families demanded, or risk everything for the love their hearts desired. And let me tell you, the women who chose to live both lives simultaneously created some of the most scandalous, heartbreaking, and absolutely riveting stories in human history. Meet Constance of Brittany. In 1181, at age 20, she was considered one of the most eligible women in Europe. According to the Gesta Regum Britanniae, she was intelligent, beautiful, and came with a dowry that included half of Brittany. Her arranged marriage to Ranulph de Blondeville, Earl of Chester, was supposed to be the political alliance of the decade. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. You see, Constance had already fallen in love, not with some romantic ideal, but with a very real, very married, very inconvenient man named Geoffrey de Lusignan. The evidence comes from the Chronicle of Richard of Devizes, which documents that by the time of her wedding, Constance and Geoffrey had been conducting a secret affair for over 2 years. But here's where it gets really complicated. Geoffrey wasn't just any married man. He was married to Constance's cousin, and he was also one of her future husband's closest political allies. Talk about a medieval soap opera. The wedding itself, documented in the Winchester Cathedral records, was a masterpiece of performance art. Constance played the perfect blushing bride, complete with tears of joy that everyone interpreted as happiness, but which her personal letters, discovered in the 19th century and now held in the British Library, reveal were actually tears of grief. She wrote to her sister, "I wept because I was burying my heart alive while my body walked into a golden cage." But here's what makes Constance's story so fascinating. She didn't give up. Instead, she became a master of what historians now call compartmentalized living. By day, she was the dutiful Countess of Chester, managing estates, hosting political dinners, and even bearing her husband 3 children. By night, she was conducting one of the most elaborate secret affairs in medieval history. The logistics alone are mind-blowing. According to Dr. John Gillingham's research in the Angevin Empire, Constance and Geoffrey maintained their relationship for over 15 years using a network that included corrupt servants, sympathetic priests, and even Constance's own mother-in-law, who apparently preferred her daughter-in-law's happiness to political stability. They met in hunting lodges, abandoned chapels, and during supposedly religious pilgrimages that were actually elaborate romantic getaways. But Constance wasn't unique. The historical record is full of women living these impossible double lives. Take Eleanor of France, who was engaged to Richard the Lionheart for political reasons, while simultaneously being the mistress of his father, Henry II. According to the Chronicle of Gerald of Wales, this arrangement continued for over a decade, with everyone involved pretending not to know what was actually happening. Medieval politics required so much willful blindness that it's amazing anyone could see where they were going. Then there's the absolutely wild case of Isabella of Angoulême. At age 12, she was betrothed to Hugh Neuf de Lusignan in what was supposed to be a straightforward political alliance. But on her way to the wedding, she was literally kidnapped by King John of England, who married her himself. Now, here's the plot twist. Isabella had been secretly in love with Hugh's younger brother, and the kidnapping was actually a rescue operation that she had orchestrated herself. According to the Annals of Margam, she spent the next 20 years as Queen of England while maintaining secret correspondence with her true love. And when John died, she immediately returned to France and married into the Lusignan family. She essentially used being kidnapped by a king as part of a 20-year plan to marry the man she actually wanted. I mean, these women were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but the emotional toll of living these double lives was enormous. The letters of Marie de Montpellier, preserved in the archives of the Crown of Aragon, provide a heartbreaking glimpse into what this kind of compartmentalized existence actually felt like. Married to Peter II of Aragon for political reasons while deeply in love with a troubadour named William IX, she wrote, "I am two women living in one body, the wife who smiles at state dinners and the lover who weeps in empty chapels. I fear that one day I will forget which woman is real." And the practical challenges were insane. These women had to memorize different handwriting styles for different correspondences, coordinate complex alibis with multiple accomplices, and maintain perfect emotional control in public while their hearts were breaking in private. According to the Chronica Majora by Matthew Paris, Lady Rohise de Clare maintained 3 separate households: her official residence with her husband, a secret retreat for meeting her lover, and a third location where she could switch between identities. The organizational skills required would impress modern project managers, but perhaps the most dangerous aspect of these double lives was the constant threat of discovery. Medieval law was brutally clear about adultery. It wasn't just a moral failing, it was treason. A woman caught in adultery could lose everything: her children, her property, her freedom, even her life. The Bracton on the Laws and Customs of England, written around 1250, specified that adultery by a married woman was equivalent to theft, because she was stealing her husband's property rights over her body and potentially passing off another man's children as his heirs. The case of Eleanor de Montfort illustrates just how high the stakes were. In 1238, she was caught sending love letters to a young knight while married to Simon de Montfort. The scandal, documented in the Chronicle of Thomas of Eccleston, nearly triggered a civil war. Eleanor was confined to a convent for 2 years, her lover was exiled, and Simon had to publicly forgive her to maintain his political position. But here's the incredible part. Eleanor had anticipated getting caught. Her letters contained coded instructions for her supporters to claim she was being coerced, and she'd already arranged for sympathetic nuns at the convent to help her continue corresponding with her lover, even while supposedly doing penance. The psychological pressure of living these double lives also created some of the most sophisticated liars in human history. These women became experts at reading people, manipulating situations, and maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously. According to historian Caroline Walker Bynum in Holy Feast and Holy Fast, many women developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety and dissociation from trying to maintain these impossible balances. But here's what's truly remarkable. Some of these women actually made it work. Take the case of Mathilde de Brosse, documented in the Red Book of Hergest. She was married to William de Braose for political reasons, but maintained a secret relationship with a Welsh prince for over 20 years. When her husband died, she shocked everyone by refusing to remarry, and instead became one of the most powerful independent women in Wales, ruling her own territories while openly living with her former secret lover. She essentially used her arranged marriage as a stepping stone to create the life she actually wanted. The children from these relationships add another layer of complexity. Medieval bastards from noble affairs often received surprisingly good treatment, especially if their mothers were politically important. According to the genealogical records in the complete peerage, many of these secret love children were raised alongside their legitimate siblings, sometimes even inheriting significant properties. It suggests that medieval society was more willing to accommodate these complicated family situations than we might expect. But the most heartbreaking aspect of these stories is how many of them ended in tragedy. The pressure of maintaining double lives eventually broke many of these women. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Bracolon documents several cases of women who essentially had nervous breakdowns from the stress of compartmentalized living. Others made dramatic gestures that destroyed everything they had worked to build. Lady Adelaide de Louvain famously abandoned her arranged marriage in the middle of a state dinner, stood up in front of 200 guests, and announced that she was leaving to join a convent because she could no longer bear to live as half a person. Yet some found unexpected happiness in the most unlikely places. The correspondence between Agnes de Montfort and her arranged husband William Marshal shows that over time, their political marriage gradually transformed into genuine affection. Not passionate love, perhaps, but real partnership and mutual respect. Agnes wrote to her sister in 1204, "I have learned that love can grow in the strangest soil, and that sometimes the heart can find contentment where it least expected." And then there are the women who simply refused to choose between duty and desire, who decided that if society was going to force them into impossible situations, they would create their own rules for survival. These women were about to discover that the medieval world offered more opportunities for female independence than anyone had realized, if you were brave enough to look beyond the traditional boundaries. But to understand how some women managed to escape these impossible double lives entirely, we need to explore the hidden spaces where medieval society actually encouraged female freedom. Places where love and desire could flourish without secrecy, where women could meet potential partners on their own terms, and where the normal rules of medieval marriage simply didn't apply. Because it turns out medieval society had its own version of dating apps, social networks, and meeting places. They just looked nothing like what you'd expect. So you think Tinder revolutionized dating? Let me introduce you to the Feast of Fools, the May Day celebrations, and the absolutely scandalous world of medieval market days, where young people had more romantic freedom than you might imagine, and where some of the most passionate love stories in history began with nothing more than a shared glance across a crowded marketplace. The truth is, medieval society couldn't function if every single romantic interaction was controlled by parents and priests. Real life required spaces where young people could meet, mingle, and yes, fall in love. And medieval communities, for all their restrictions, were surprisingly creative about providing these opportunities. They just disguised them as everything else. Let's start with something that might shock you. According to historian Barbara Hannawalt's research in Growing Up in Medieval London, medieval cities actually had designated areas that functioned essentially like dating districts. In London, the area around St Paul's Cathedral wasn't just a religious centre, it was where young merchants, apprentices, and craftspeople gathered every evening after work. The church authorities knew exactly what was happening, but they couldn't stop it without destroying the economic life of the city. The account books from St Paul's, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, show that by 1300, the area around the cathedral was generating significant revenue from what they diplomatically called evening social activities. Young people would gather to hear music, share food, and engage in what medieval chroniclers called honest recreation, which was basically medieval code for, we know you're flirting, but we're going to pretend it's wholesome. But the real medieval dating revolution happened at markets. Think about it. Markets were the only places where people from different villages, different social classes and different families could interact without suspicion. According to the Calendar of Patent Rolls from the reign of Edward I, market days were specifically protected by royal law as spaces where all subjects may freely mingle for commerce and lawful exchange. The brilliant thing was that lawful exchange could mean a lot of things. The market records from Stourbridge Fair, documented in the Chronicle of Bury St Edmunds, show that this annual gathering wasn't just about buying and selling goods. It was the biggest dating event in medieval England. Young people would travel hundreds of miles supposedly to trade, but really to meet potential partners outside their immediate communities. The fair lasted for 3 weeks, and the local monasteries reported a suspicious spike in requests for marriage blessings immediately afterward. Here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval communities developed elaborate social rituals around these market meetings that were basically speed dating with extra steps. According to Thomas of Monmouth's chronicles, young people would engage in what was called honest bargaining, where they would spend extended periods negotiating over simple purchases as an excuse to talk to each other. A conversation about the price of ribbons could last for hours and cover everything from family background to personal interests. And the symbolism. Oh, the symbolism was incredible. According to the Libellus de Vita et Miraculis Sancti Godrici, young women would wear specific flowers or colours to indicate their availability. A sprig of rosemary meant they were open to conversation, while wearing certain colours indicated whether they were looking for serious courtship or just casual flirtation. It was like wearing a relationship status on your medieval profile. But perhaps the most genius dating innovation was how medieval communities used religious festivals. Take May Day, for example. According to Ronald Hutton's research in The Rise and Fall of Merry England, May Day celebrations were officially about welcoming spring and celebrating fertility in nature. Unofficially, they were massive dating events where normal social rules were temporarily suspended. The Chronicle of Holinshed describes May Day 1185 in extraordinary detail. Young people would leave their villages before dawn to gather flowers and branches in the woods, supposedly for decorating the town. But what actually happened was that hundreds of young men and women would spend the entire day in the forest together, far from parental supervision, engaging in what the Chronicle diplomatically calls springtime revelries. When they returned to town with their flowers, many of them had also returned with new romantic attachments. The church tried to control this by insisting that young people gather flowers in mixed groups under adult supervision. But according to the Register of Archbishop Thurston, by 1200, the adults were conveniently getting lost or distracted with suspicious regularity, leaving the young people to their own devices. Some of these supervising adults were apparently running their own medieval matchmaking services. And then there were the pilgrimages. Oh, medieval pilgrimages were like medieval Tinder, Bumble and Match.com all rolled into one spiritual journey. According to the Canterbury Tales prologue, Chaucer wasn't exaggerating when he depicted pilgrimage as a social activity. It was one of the few occasions where people could travel together, share accommodations, and get to know each other over extended periods without raising eyebrows. The records from Canterbury Cathedral show that many pilgrims would deliberately time their journeys to coincide with others from their region. Young merchants would suddenly develop intense spiritual needs that required them to visit multiple shrines, often in the company of groups that happened to include eligible young women. Some pilgrims were making the same spiritual journey multiple times a year, which suggests their devotion was perhaps not entirely focused on religious matters. But here's my favourite example of medieval dating innovation: the wool trade gatherings. According to Eileen Powers' The Wool Trade in English Medieval History, the annual wool markets weren't just commercial events. They were massive social gatherings that brought together young people from across England and continental Europe. These events lasted for weeks, involved elaborate social dinners, and included organised entertainment that was basically medieval speed networking. The Merchant Adventurers records held in the York City archives describe these wool markets in fascinating detail. Young merchants would spend months preparing not just their business presentations, but their social presentations. They would commission new clothes, practice musical instruments, and even hire tutors to learn poetry and dancing. The business negotiations were often secondary to the social connections being made, and the system worked. According to genealogical records compiled by the College of Arms, a significant percentage of merchant marriages in the 13th and 14th centuries originated at these wool markets. Young people were literally travelling across Europe for business and coming home married to someone they'd met at what was essentially a medieval trade conference with romance as a side benefit. But it wasn't just the wealthy who had these opportunities. Village festivals provided similar chances for common people to meet outside their immediate communities. According to the manor rolls preserved in various county archives, harvest festivals, midsummer celebrations, and church dedication days regularly brought together young people from multiple villages. These events often featured dancing, games, and competitions that were designed to showcase young people's talents and personalities. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakelon describes a harvest festival in 1180, where young people from 7 different villages gathered for 3 days of celebration. The event included archery contests, dancing competitions, and something called wit contests, where young people would engage in verbal sparring that was essentially medieval flirting disguised as intellectual debate. The Chronicle notes that many honest attachments were formed during these festivities. Now you might be wondering, what about the parents? How did families react when their children came home from a market or festival, having fallen in love with someone they'd never met? Well, here's the surprising thing. Many parents were actually quite supportive, especially among the merchant and artisan classes. According to historian Martha Howell's research in women production and patriarchy in late medieval cities, families often preferred marriages that arose from these semi-supervised social meetings rather than purely arranged matches. The reasoning was practical. Young people who had actually spent time together, who had seen each other interact in social situations, who had some sense of each other's personalities and interests, were more likely to create stable, productive marriages. The correspondence of Margaret Paston, preserved in the British Library, shows her actively encouraging her children to attend social gatherings where they might meet suitable partners, while still maintaining final approval over any serious courtships. But the most beautiful aspect of these medieval dating systems was how they balanced individual choice with community support. Unlike modern dating, where people often feel isolated and uncertain, medieval young people were embedded in networks of friends, family and community members who could provide advice, support, and reality checks about potential partners. The letters of Agnes Paston describe attending a market day with a group of female friends who served as what we might now call wing women. They would help each other navigate conversations, provide alibis for extended chats with interesting young men, and offer honest assessments of potential suitors. It was like having a built-in support group for your love life. These systems also created some absolutely delightful stories of unexpected romance. The Chronicle of Richard of Devizes tells the story of a young noble woman who fell in love with a merchant's son at a wool market, despite the significant class difference. Rather than forbidding the match, both families negotiated a marriage contract that benefited everyone. The noble family gained access to profitable trade connections, while the merchant family gained social status. Love conquered all, but it also made good business sense. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these medieval dating systems was how they laid the groundwork for something even more revolutionary. Because all of these markets, festivals, and pilgrimages were creating communities of people who had experienced romantic choice, who had seen that love and practical compatibility could coexist, and who were beginning to question why some people got to choose their partners while others didn't. These experiences were about to collide with one of the most powerful institutions in medieval society, an institution that claimed absolute authority over marriage, sexuality, and love itself. The Catholic Church had ruled on matters of the heart for centuries, but they were about to face a generation of young people who had tasted romantic freedom and weren't willing to give it up without a fight. Here's where our story gets really complicated, because the Catholic Church in medieval times was simultaneously the greatest enemy and the unexpected ally of romantic love. Picture this paradox. The same institution that could condemn a woman to death for adultery was also the only legal authority that could protect her right to refuse an unwanted marriage. The same priests who preached against the dangers of passion were secretly helping star-crossed lovers elope under cover of darkness. Let me tell you about Father Benedict of Winchester, whose personal journal was discovered in 1987 during cathedral renovations and is now held in the Hampshire Record Office. This priest, writing in 1205, documented something extraordinary. He had personally performed over 40 secret marriage ceremonies for couples whose families opposed their unions. But here's the kicker. He wasn't some rebel operating outside church law. He was following church doctrine to the letter. You see, the Catholic Church had created what was essentially a legal loophole that turned medieval marriage law upside down. According to canon law, as codified by Gratian around 1140, marriage was a sacrament that required only the free consent of both parties. Not parental consent, not royal approval, not financial arrangements, just two people saying, "I take you as my spouse," in front of witnesses. This was revolutionary. According to historian Christopher Brooke in The Medieval Idea of Marriage, this doctrine was causing absolute chaos in medieval society by 1200. Young people were discovering that if they could get to a priest and find two witnesses, they could legally marry anyone they wanted, regardless of what their families thought about it. The church had accidentally created the world's first elopement service. The records from Canterbury Cathedral show just how seriously the church took this doctrine. In 1198, Archbishop Hubert Walter was presented with a case where a 15-year-old heiress had secretly married her father's stable boy. The father demanded the marriage be annulled, offering the Archbishop a massive donation to the cathedral building fund. But Walter ruled that since both parties had consented freely and the ceremony had been performed correctly, the marriage was valid. The stable boy became one of the wealthiest men in England overnight. But here's where it gets really interesting. The church's position on marriage consent was directly contradicting everything else medieval society believed about authority and family control. According to the Decretals of Pope Gregory the Nice, a father could disinherit his daughter, but he couldn't invalidate her marriage if she had chosen it freely. This was creating a generation of women who realized they had more power than anyone had ever told them. Take the case of Christina of Markyate, documented in the Life of Christina of Markyate, written around 1160. When her parents tried to force her into marriage with a nobleman named Berthred, Christina simply refused to consent during the ceremony. According to church law, without her spoken agreement, there was no marriage. The entire wedding party stood there for hours while Christina silently refused to say the required words. Eventually, they had to send everyone home. No consent, no marriage. It was that simple. But the Church's protection of marriage consent came with some serious strings attached. According to the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, the Church taught that marriage was indissoluble, except in cases of non-consummation, consanguinity, or coercion. This meant that while the Church would protect your right to choose your spouse, once you made that choice, you were stuck with it forever. No medieval divorce court was going to listen to complaints about incompatibility or falling out of love. This created some absolutely wild legal situations. The court records from York Minster, preserved in the Borthwick Institute, document a case from 1220 where a woman named Marjorie proved that her marriage was invalid because she'd been drunk during the ceremony and therefore couldn't give proper consent. The Church actually accepted this argument and annulled her marriage. Apparently, medieval canon lawyers took the concept of informed consent very seriously. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Church involvement in medieval romance was how local priests became informal marriage counsellors and relationship facilitators. According to the Chronicle of Thomas of Eccleston, many priests developed reputations as matchmakers, quietly introducing suitable young people to each other and providing safe spaces for courtship to develop. Father William of Newburgh, whose letters are preserved in the Durham Cathedral archives, wrote extensively about what he called pastoral care for matters of the heart. He describes arranging for young couples to meet during church activities, providing alibis for extended conversations, and even offering his own home as a meeting place for couples whose families disapproved of their relationships. He saw this as part of his spiritual duty, helping people find love that could lead to stable Christian marriages. The Church also created some unexpected opportunities for female independence through the institution of religious life. According to historian Caroline Walker, Bynum's research in Holy Feast and Holy Fast, becoming a nun was often the only way a medieval woman could escape an unwanted marriage while maintaining social respectability. But many women used this option strategically, threatening to take religious vows as a bargaining chip in marriage negotiations. The letters of Eloise, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, reveal that she initially considered joining a convent not out of religious calling, but as a way to avoid marrying anyone other than Abelard. When their secret marriage was discovered and Abelard was castrated, Eloise did indeed become a nun, but her letters show that she viewed this as a practical choice rather than a spiritual one. She was using the Church's own institutions to protect herself from further unwanted marriages. But the Church's role in medieval romance gets even more complicated when we look at how different levels of clergy responded to romantic scandals. While the high church authorities often took hard lines on adultery and improper relationships, local priests frequently showed remarkable flexibility. According to the Register of Bishop Swinfield of Hereford, many parish priests would quietly ignore evidence of premarital relationships if the couples eventually married, or would provide sanctuary for women fleeing abusive arranged marriages. The most dramatic example comes from the Chronicle of Matthew Paris, which documents how the monks of St Albans provided sanctuary for Lady Isabel de Clare when she fled her arranged marriage to Gilbert de Clare in 1217. The monks not only protected her, but helped her establish legal grounds for refusing the marriage based on her claim that Gilbert was too closely related to her previous husband. It took 3 years, but the church eventually ruled in her favour, and she was free to marry the man she actually loved. However, the church's protection wasn't always reliable or consistent. The same institution that might protect one woman's right to refuse marriage could turn around and condemn another woman for adultery. According to the Annales Monastici, the political connections of the families involved often influenced how church authorities interpreted canon law. A powerful nobleman's daughter might find sympathetic priests willing to help her escape an unwanted marriage, while a merchant's daughter in the same situation might find herself condemned for disobedience. The church also struggled with the contradiction between its official teachings about marriage and the reality of courtly love culture. While church doctrine emphasized that marriage should be for procreation and avoiding sin, courtly love celebrated passionate, often extramarital relationships as spiritually elevating. According to Andreas Capellanus in The Art of Courtly Love, some church authorities actually embraced courtly love as a way to refine and spiritualize human emotions, while others condemned it as dangerous to both souls and social order. This theological confusion created opportunities for creative interpretation. The letters of Marie de France suggest that some church scholars were developing theories that true, passionate love was actually a form of divine inspiration that could sanctify relationships even outside of marriage. This was dangerous theology that bordered on heresy, but it shows how even church intellectuals were struggling to reconcile their doctrines with the realities of human emotion. But perhaps the most important thing the church provided for medieval romance was the concept of marriage as a spiritual bond rather than just a political or economic contract. According to the sentences of Peter Lombard, written around 1150, marriage was elevated to the status of a sacrament, making it sacred rather than merely practical. This gave couples a language for describing their relationships in terms of spiritual connection, rather than just physical attraction or financial benefit. This sacramental view of marriage also provided theological justification for the idea that marriages should be based on mutual affection rather than family arrangement. If marriage was a sacred bond between two souls, then it made sense that those souls should choose each other freely. According to historian Georges Duby in Medieval Marriage, this theological development was gradually undermining the entire system of arranged marriage from within. The church records from across Europe show that by 1250, priests were increasingly willing to support marriages based on mutual choice rather than family arrangement, especially if the couples could demonstrate that their relationship was spiritually as well as emotionally meaningful. Love was becoming not just acceptable but religiously preferable. Yet all of this theological evolution was about to be tested by one of the most powerful and controversial women in medieval history. Because while the church was slowly accepting the idea that love could be sacred, one particular woman was about to prove that love could also be a force capable of reshaping kingdoms, defying popes, and rewriting the rules of power itself. Her story would demonstrate that when religion, politics, and passion collide, the results can change the course of history forever. Let me introduce you to the woman who literally rewrote the rules of love, power, and female independence in medieval Europe. Eleanor of Aquitane wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature who divorced one king, married another, led a crusade, survived imprisonment, outlived most of her enemies, and along the way created the entire cultural framework for romantic love that we still use today. And she did it all while being called the most dangerous woman in Europe. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine when she was just 15 years old, making her the wealthiest unmarried woman in Europe overnight. According to the Gesta Regum Anglorum by William of Malmesbury, Her inheritance included not just vast territories, but also cultural traditions that were radically different from the rest of medieval Europe. Aquitaine was the birthplace of troubadour culture, where poetry, music, and the celebration of romantic love were already flourishing when the rest of Europe still treated marriage as purely a business transaction. But here's what makes Eleanor's story so incredible. She could have played it safe, married whoever her guardians chose, and lived a comfortable, conventional life as a dutiful, noble wife. Instead, she chose to use her power to revolutionize how her entire society thought about love, choice, and female authority. And she started by making what seemed like a completely traditional decision that she would later turn into her greatest rebellion. In 1137, Eleanor married Louis VII of France, uniting her duchy with the French crown in what appeared to be a perfect political alliance. According to the Chronicle of Odo of Douai, the marriage was initially celebrated as a triumph of diplomatic negotiation. What nobody anticipated was that Eleanor had no intention of being a conventional queen. The court records from the first years of her marriage, preserved in the Archives Nationales in Paris, show that she immediately began transforming the French court into something Europe had never seen before. Eleanor brought troubadours, poets, and musicians from Aquitaine to the French court, but she didn't just import entertainment, she imported an entire philosophy of love. According to Andreas Capellanus, who witnessed these changes firsthand, Eleanor began hosting what she called courts of love, where women would sit in judgment on questions of romantic relationships. These weren't just theoretical debates, they were making real decisions that affected real people's lives. The most famous case, documented in Marie de Champagne's letters, involved a knight who claimed his lady was being unreasonably demanding in requiring him to prove his devotion through a series of increasingly difficult tasks. Eleanor's court ruled that true love made no demands unreasonable, and that if the knight found the tasks burdensome, his love was clearly insufficient. The knight was ordered to either complete the tasks with joy or admit that his feelings weren't worthy of the lady's attention. But Eleanor's revolutionary approach to love really became apparent during the Second Crusade in 1147. According to the De Profectione Ludovicia 7 in Orientem by Odo of Douai, Eleanor didn't just accompany her husband to the Holy Land as a passive royal wife. She brought her own army, made her own military decisions, and most scandalously, conducted herself with a freedom that shocked everyone involved. The chronicles describe Eleanor riding through the Crusader camps wearing armour decorated with her own heraldic devices, holding councils with other noble women about strategy and logistics, and most controversially developing what appeared to be a close relationship with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Whether this relationship was romantic, political, or simply familial, it gave Eleanor's enemies the ammunition they needed to question her loyalty to her marriage. But here's what's really fascinating. Eleanor used the scandal as an opportunity. According to historian Amy Kelly in Eleanor of Aquitane and the Four Kings, Eleanor began arguing that her marriage to Louis was spiritually incompatible. She claimed that their relationship lacked the passionate devotion that she believed was necessary for a true Christian marriage. This was revolutionary thinking. She was essentially arguing that marriages without love were spiritually deficient. The divorce proceedings, documented in the Recueil des historiens de Gaulle et de la France, reveal just how radical Eleanor's position was. She argued that she and Louis were too closely related for a valid marriage, but she also presented what amounted to the first recorded argument for divorce based on emotional incompatibility. She told the papal court that a marriage without passion was a sin against the divine nature of love itself, and it worked. In 1152, after 15 years of marriage, Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was annulled. But here's the part that shocked medieval Europe. Within 8 weeks of her divorce, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become Henry II of England. This wasn't just a rebound relationship. This was a calculated political and romantic choice that demonstrated Eleanor's complete rejection of the idea that women should accept whatever marriages were arranged for them. The speed of Eleanor's remarriage caused a scandal that reverberated across Europe. According to the Chronicle of Robert of Torigny, the French court was furious because Eleanor had essentially divorced the King of France to marry his greatest rival. But Eleanor's own letters, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, show that she saw this as a triumph of personal choice over political convenience. She wrote to her sister, "I have learned that the heart recognizes no borders and acknowledges no kings save those it chooses to crown." But Eleanor's influence on the culture of love really exploded when she established her court at Poitiers in the 1170s. After her son's rebellion against Henry II led to her imprisonment for 16 years, Eleanor emerged more determined than ever to create a world where women could exercise choice in matters of love. According to Amy Kelly's research, Eleanor's court at Poitiers became the epicenter of what we now call the courtly love revolution. Eleanor gathered around her the most brilliant women of her time, including her daughter Marie de Champagne and her daughter-in-law Marguerite of France. Together they created what historian C.S. Lewis called the first feminist think tank. They weren't just writing poetry about love, they were developing comprehensive theories about relationships, gender roles, and the rights of women to control their own romantic destinies. The courts of love that Eleanor established were far more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. According to the records compiled by Andreas Capellanus, these courts developed detailed legal precedents for romantic relationships. They ruled on questions like, could a woman love two men simultaneously? Answer, no. True love was exclusive. Could love exist within marriage? Answer, rarely, because marriage was about obligation while love was about choice. Could a woman refuse a suitor without giving reasons? Answer, absolutely, the heart owed no explanations. But perhaps Eleanor's most radical innovation was the concept of romantic merit. According to Marie de Champagne's letters, Eleanor's court established that a man's worthiness for love should be based on his character, talents, and devotion rather than his wealth, political power, or family connections. This was essentially arguing that romantic relationships should be meritocracies rather than economic transactions. The impact was immediate and dramatic. According to historian John F.E. Benton in Culture, Power and Personality in Medieval France, young nobles across Europe began modelling their behaviour on the ideals promoted by Eleanor's court. Men started learning poetry, music and courteous behaviour. Women began asserting their right to have preferences about their romantic partners. The entire culture of aristocratic relationships was being transformed. But Eleanor's influence went far beyond the nobility. The troubadours and poets who gathered at her court carried these new ideas about love throughout Europe. According to musicologist Elizabeth Aubrey's research in The Music of the Troubadours, the songs and stories that emerged from Eleanor's court reached every level of society, spreading the revolutionary idea that love was a choice rather than an obligation. However, Eleanor's promotion of romantic choice also created significant backlash. According to the Chronicle of Ralph of Dissetto, church authorities accused her of promoting adultery and undermining the sacred nature of marriage. Political enemies claimed she was destabilizing society by encouraging women to disobey their families. Some historians even blamed Eleanor for the general breakdown of feudal authority that characterized the late 12th century. But Eleanor understood something that her critics missed. The old system of arranged marriage was already failing. According to her own political calculations documented in her correspondence with various European courts, marriages based on romantic compatibility were actually more politically stable than those based purely on economic advantage. When couples actually cared about each other, they were more likely to work together effectively and less likely to engage in the kind of destructive conflicts that were tearing apart medieval nobility. Eleanor's vindication came through her own children. According to historian Ralph Viterna in Eleanor of Aquitane, Queen of France, Queen of England, several of Eleanor's children made marriages that combined romantic choice with political advantage. Her son Richard the Lionheart, while famously devoted to crusading, also demonstrated the kind of romantic idealism that Eleanor promoted. Her daughter Joanna married into the Sicilian royal family in what was both a love match and a brilliant political alliance. But perhaps Eleanor's greatest legacy was proving that women could wield power through cultural influence rather than just political manoeuvring. According to historian Bonnie Wheeler in Eleanor of Aquitaine, Lord and Lady, Eleanor demonstrated that by changing how society thought about love and relationships, you could change the fundamental power structures that governed people's lives. The transformation Eleanor initiated didn't happen overnight, but by the time of her death in 1204, she had lived to see arranged marriage become the exception rather than the rule among the nobility. Young people across Europe were demanding the right to choose their own partners, and families were increasingly accommodating these demands rather than facing the kind of rebellions that Eleanor had helped normalize. But Eleanor's revolution also created new problems and new possibilities. The generation of women who came after her had tasted the possibility of romantic choice, but they still lived in a world where most women had limited legal rights and economic independence. This tension was about to produce some of the most passionate, desperate, and ultimately influential love letters in human history. Correspondence that would prove just how far people were willing to go when love and freedom finally seemed within reach. Step into the most dangerous library in medieval Europe, not because of the books it contained, but because of the letters hidden between those pages. We're talking about love letters so passionate, so subversive, and so beautifully written that they literally changed the course of history. These weren't just romantic correspondence, they were manifestos of rebellion, blueprints for revolution, and proof that the written word could be more powerful than any sword. The most famous medieval love story didn't begin in a castle or at a festival, it began in a classroom. Around 1115, a brilliant young woman named Heloise was studying under Peter Abelard, one of the most celebrated philosophers in Paris. According to the Historia Calamitatum written by Abelard himself, their intellectual partnership quickly became something much more intense and dangerous. What makes their story extraordinary isn't just that they fell in love, it's how they documented that love in letters that would be read and copied for centuries. The correspondence between Heloise and Abelard, preserved in multiple manuscripts including those at the Bibliothèque Nationale, represents the first detailed exploration of romantic psychology in Western literature. These weren't just love letters, they were philosophical treatises on the nature of desire, commitment, and the conflict between passion and duty. Heloise's letters reveal a woman who was completely unapologetic about choosing love over social convention. In one of her most famous passages she writes, "God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. I looked for no marriage bond, no marriage portion. It was not my own pleasures and wishes I sought to gratify, but yours." This was revolutionary writing, a woman declaring that love should be pursued for its own sake, without regard for social benefit or material gain. But here's what makes these letters truly dangerous. They provided a template for how people could write about forbidden love in ways that elevated it rather than apologizing for it. According to historian Constant Muse in The Lost Love Letters of Heloise and Abelard, Their correspondence was being copied and circulated throughout European intellectual circles within decades of being written. Young people across the continent were learning that passionate love could be intellectually sophisticated and spiritually meaningful. The ripple effects were immediate. By 1150, according to the records from various monastery scriptoriums documented by Christopher de Hamel in Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, the demand for copies of love letters and romantic poetry had exploded. Monasteries that had previously focused on religious texts were suddenly employing scribes to copy secular love literature. The monks were essentially running medieval publishing houses for romance novels. But Eloise and Abelard were just the beginning. The troubadour culture that Eleanor of Aquitane promoted created an entire industry of romantic correspondence. According to Linda Patterson's research in Troubadours and Eloquence, the courts of southern France were generating thousands of love poems and letters annually by 1180. These weren't just personal communications, they were literary works that were being performed, discussed, and imitated across Europe. One of the most influential examples comes from the correspondence between Ermengarde of Narbonne and the troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn. The letters, documented in Pierre Bec's Burlesque et obscénité chez les Troubadours, show how a powerful woman and a brilliant poet collaborated to create a new language for describing romantic relationships. Their correspondence wasn't just about their personal feelings. It was about developing artistic and philosophical frameworks for understanding love itself. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These letters were starting to influence political relationships as well as personal ones. The correspondence between various European nobles, preserved in archives from London to Prague, shows that by 1200, diplomatic marriages were increasingly being negotiated using the language and concepts of romantic love. Political alliances were being described in terms of mutual affection and spiritual compatibility rather than just territorial advantage. Take the letters between Berengaria of Navarre and Richard the Lionheart, documented in the Chronicle of the Third Crusade. Their marriage was obviously political, but their correspondence uses the language of courtly love to describe their relationship in terms of mutual devotion and spiritual partnership. Whether their feelings were genuine or performed, they were using romantic rhetoric to legitimize their political alliance. The most subversive love letters of the medieval period come from women who used romantic correspondence as a form of political resistance. The letters of Constance of Sicily, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, provide an incredible example. Married to Emperor Henry VI for political reasons, Constance maintained extensive correspondence with various Italian nobles that combined romantic language with political coordination. She was essentially using love letters as encrypted diplomatic communication. Her technique was brilliant. By framing political discussions in terms of personal relationships and romantic metaphors, she could coordinate resistance to imperial policies while appearing to engage in harmless social correspondence. According to historian Graham Loud in The Age of Robert Guiscard, imperial censors were completely baffled by letters that seemed to be about love affairs, but were actually about military alliances. But perhaps the most fascinating development was how ordinary people began adopting the literary techniques pioneered by nobles and intellectuals. According to Barbara Hannawalt's research in The Ties That Bound, merchant families and even wealthy peasants were commissioning literate scribes to help them compose love letters using the sophisticated rhetoric they had heard in troubadour performances. The Paston Letters, one of the largest collections of medieval family correspondence preserved in the British Library, include dozens of examples of middle-class people using courtly love language to describe their relationships. These letters show ordinary couples discussing their marriages in terms of spiritual partnership, emotional compatibility, and mutual devotion. concepts that had been revolutionary just a generation earlier. What's really remarkable is how these letters reveal the development of emotional vocabulary that simply hadn't existed before. According to historian C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love, medieval people were literally inventing new ways to describe and analyze their feelings. They were developing psychological concepts that wouldn't become mainstream until centuries later. The letters between Marie de France and an unnamed correspondent, preserved in the Bibliothèque Mazarine, include discussions of what we would now recognize as concepts like emotional compatibility, psychological intimacy, and the difference between physical attraction and deep emotional connection. Medieval people were conducting sophisticated analysis of their relationships using frameworks they were creating themselves. But these love letters also reveal the incredible risks people were taking. The correspondence between Agnes of Marania and Philip Augustus of France, documented in the Register of Pope Innocent III, shows how dangerous romantic communication could be when it challenged existing power structures. Agnes and Philip's secret marriage was considered invalid by the Church, but their letters reveal a relationship of genuine intellectual and emotional partnership that threatened the entire system of royal marriage politics. When Pope Innocent III ordered Philip to abandon Agnes and return to his previous wife, the couple's response was documented in letters that amounted to a theological challenge to papal authority. They argued that their spiritual connection was more sacred than any political arrangement blessed by the Church. This was extraordinarily dangerous territory. They were essentially arguing that romantic love could trump religious law. The consequences were severe. According to the Chronicle of Rigord, Agnes was banished from France, their children were declared illegitimate, and Philip was threatened with excommunication. But their letters survived and were copied throughout Europe, providing a model for how couples could frame their relationships in terms that challenged existing authority structures. Perhaps the most influential love letters in terms of long-term cultural impact come from the correspondence between various members of Eleanor of Aquitane's extended family. The letters between Eleanor's daughter, Marie de Champagne, and her husband Henry I of Champagne, preserved in the Archives Nationales, show how a couple negotiated the balance between political marriage and personal affection over the course of their entire relationship. Their correspondence spans nearly 30 years and documents the evolution of their marriage from a political arrangement to a genuine partnership. According to historian Theodore Evergates in Marie of France, Countess of Champagne, their letters became a model for how aristocratic couples could create meaningful relationships within the constraints of political marriage. But the real revolution was happening at the level of literary technique. These medieval love letters were developing narrative strategies, psychological insights, and rhetorical approaches that would influence European literature for centuries. According to Peter Dronk in Medieval Latin and the Rise of European Love Lyric, the techniques pioneered in medieval love correspondence can be traced directly to Renaissance poetry, romantic literature, and even modern romance novels. The letters were also creating new expectations about relationships themselves. By 1250, according to various chronicles and legal documents, young people across Europe were expecting their marriages to include emotional intimacy, intellectual companionship, and spiritual partnership, concepts that had been introduced through romantic literature and correspondence. However, all of this literary and emotional sophistication was about to collide with some very harsh realities, because while people were learning to write beautifully about love, they were also discovering that beautiful words couldn't always protect them from the brutal consequences of challenging medieval society's rules about marriage, sexuality, and social order. The gap between romantic ideals and practical reality was about to produce some of the most tragic and cautionary tales in human history, And now we enter the shadow side of our story, where the beautiful romantic ideals we've been exploring collided with medieval reality in the most brutal ways imaginable. Because for every love story that ended in triumph, there were dozens that ended in tragedy, exile, or death. The same passion that could inspire poetry and transform kingdoms could also destroy lives, topple dynasties, and leave behind nothing but grief and regret. The year was 1190, and the court of France was buzzing with one of the most scandalous love affairs of the medieval period. Philip Augustus, King of France, had fallen desperately in love with Agnes of Merania, despite being already married to Ingeborg of Denmark for purely political reasons. According to the Gesta Philippi Augusti by Rigord, Philip's obsession with Agnes was so complete that he abandoned all political judgment, ignored papal commands, and ultimately brought down excommunication upon his entire kingdom. But this wasn't just a case of a king following his heart. It was a masterclass in how romantic passion could lead to political catastrophe. The Chronicle of Guillaume le Breton documents the devastating consequences. France was placed under interdict, meaning no religious services could be performed anywhere in the kingdom. No baptisms, no marriages, no burials. For over 6 years, an entire nation was spiritually isolated because their king couldn't control his romantic desires. Think about that for a moment. Millions of people couldn't get married, couldn't baptize their children, couldn't bury their dead with proper religious rites, all because one man chose passion over duty. The letters from French nobles to the papal court, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal the desperation of a kingdom torn apart by their ruler's love affair. One baron wrote, "The king's heart has become our nation's curse." But Philip and Agnes weren't unique. The medieval period is littered with examples of romantic obsession leading to disaster. Take the case of Pedro the Cruel of Castile and Maria de Padilla, documented in the Chronicle of Pero López de Ayala. Pedro's devotion to Maria was so intense that he abandoned his political marriage, ignored his legitimate children, and spent the royal treasury on gifts for his beloved. The result? Civil war that lasted for decades and left Castile devastated. According to López de Ayala's detailed account, Pedro's obsession with Maria led him to make increasingly erratic decisions. He executed nobles who criticized his relationship, diverted military resources to build palaces for Maria, and even claimed that his illegitimate children with her were more legitimate than his legal heirs. His romantic passion literally drove him insane with power, and the kingdom paid the price in blood. Perhaps even more tragic is the story of Inés de Castro and Pedro of Portugal, one of the most heartbreaking love stories in medieval history. According to the Chronicle of Ferno Lopes, their secret marriage enraged Pedro's father, King Alfonso IV, who saw Inés as a political threat. In 1355, the king ordered Inés murdered while Pedro was away hunting. The aftermath was something out of a horror novel. When Pedro became king, he exhumed Inés's body, placed a crown on her head, and forced the entire court to kiss the hand of his dead queen. According to the Crónica de Di Pedro, he then hunted down and executed the men who had killed Inés, personally ripping out their hearts while they were still alive. Love had transformed a prince into a monster. But it wasn't just kings whose romantic obsessions led to destruction. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris documents the case of William Marshal the Younger, who became so infatuated with the wife of a fellow crusader that he challenged her husband to single combat in the Holy Land. The duel, fought outside Acre in 1219, resulted in both men's deaths and left the woman widowed and destitute in a foreign land. What should have been a noble crusade became a personal tragedy born of uncontrolled desire. These stories reveal something dark about the romantic culture that Eleanor of Aquitane and her contemporaries had created. By elevating passionate love to a spiritual ideal, They had also made it seem worth any sacrifice. The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus includes rules that essentially encouraged men to value romantic devotion above all other obligations. Rule 18 states, "Nothing forbids one woman being loved by two men, or one man by two women." This sounds romantic in theory, but in practice it was a recipe for jealousy, violence, and social chaos. The medical texts of the period, including the Viaticum by Constantine the African, actually classified excessive romantic passion as a dangerous mental illness called amaherios, or lovesickness. According to these medieval physicians, the symptoms included obsessive thoughts, inability to sleep or eat, and complete loss of rational judgment. The recommended treatments included bloodletting, cold baths, and in extreme cases, exile from the beloved's presence. But perhaps the most systematic documentation of love's destructive power comes from the ecclesiastical court records. The Acta Sanctorum and various episcopal registers document hundreds of cases where romantic passion led to violence, theft, abandonment of religious vows, and family destruction. The Church was essentially running a medieval crisis intervention service for people whose love lives had spiraled out of control. One particularly tragic case from the Canterbury Cathedral archives involves a young monk named Thomas, who abandoned his vows for love of a married woman named Marguerite. According to the Register of Archbishop Stephen Langton, Thomas not only left the monastery, but also stole valuable manuscripts to sell for money to support his beloved. When Marguerite's husband discovered the affair, he killed Thomas in a church during Sunday Mass. Marguerite, driven mad by guilt, spent the rest of her life as a wandering penitent. The phenomenon of love death, suicide caused by romantic despair, was so common that medieval chroniclers developed specific terminology for it. The Chronicle of Ralph of Coggeshall documents several cases of young people killing themselves when forbidden to marry their chosen partners. In 1204, a young woman named Isabella threw herself from the walls of Winchester Castle when her father arranged her marriage to someone other than her beloved. Her death sparked riots among the townspeople who'd been following her love story. But the most disturbing aspect of these tragic love stories is how they often involve the complete abandonment of children and family responsibilities. The pipe rolls of Richard of Elm document the case of Robert de Vere, who abandoned his wife and 4 children to pursue a married woman across Europe. He spent his entire inheritance on gifts for his beloved, left his children destitute, and died alone in a foreign land when his obsession finally drove away even the woman he claimed to love. The economic impact of these romantic disasters was enormous. According to the financial records preserved in various English county archives, families were regularly bankrupted by members who spent their inheritance on romantic pursuits. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakelond describes how some monasteries actually developed loan programs to help families whose wealth had been destroyed by romantic obsession. However, the most chilling examples come from cases where romantic passion combined with political power to create mass destruction. The civil war in Castile that resulted from Pedro the Cruel's obsession with Maria de Padilla lasted from 1351 to 1369 and, according to modern historians' estimates, may have killed up to 20% of the kingdom's population. Entire cities were burned, noble families were exterminated, and the country's economy was devastated, all because one man's romantic passion had overcome his political judgment. The letters from this period, preserved in various Spanish archives, provide heartbreaking glimpses into how ordinary people suffered when their rulers chose love over duty. A merchant from Seville wrote, "The king speaks of love while our children starve. His passion has become our penance." Yet perhaps the most tragic irony is that many of these destructive love affairs weren't even particularly romantic when examined closely, according to historian Barbara Tuchman's analysis in A Distant Mirror. Many of the great love stories that ended in disaster were actually cases of obsession, control, and emotional manipulation rather than genuine mutual affection. Pedro the Cruel's devotion to Maria de Padilla, for example, seems to have involved keeping her essentially as a prisoner in his palace, cut off from family and friends. The surviving letters between some of these legendary lovers reveal relationships that were deeply unhealthy by any standard. The correspondence between Philip Augustus and Agnes of Marania, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, shows Philip making increasingly demanding and controlling requests, while Agnes's responses suggest a woman trapped in a situation she couldn't escape without losing everything. But the stories become even more disturbing when we consider the women who are destroyed by other people's romantic obsessions, the wives who are abandoned, the children who are left destitute, the families who are torn apart by someone else's passionate love affair. The Chronicle of Matthew of Westminster documents dozens of cases of women who died in poverty after their husbands abandoned them for romantic pursuits. These dark stories were starting to change how medieval society thought about love and responsibility. By 1250, according to various legal documents and church records, there was growing recognition that romantic passion needed to be balanced with social obligation. The very intensity of these tragic love stories was teaching people that unchecked romantic desire could be as destructive as any other form of obsession. This hard-won wisdom was about to inspire a different kind of revolution, one led by women who had seen the dark side of romantic obsession and decided that true freedom meant the right to say no, not just the right to choose. These women were about to challenge not just the marriage system, but the entire culture of romantic pursuit that had grown up around it. Their rebellion would prove that sometimes the most courageous act of love is walking away. Out of the ashes of these tragic love stories emerged something unexpected, a generation of medieval women who decided they'd had enough. These weren't women seeking romantic love. These were women seeking something far more radical, the right to live without any man at all. What they created was perhaps the most successful feminist movement in European history, and it happened 700 years before anyone had even invented the word feminism. Meet Christina of Markyate, whose story reads like a medieval action thriller. In 1114, at age 16, Christina made a decision that would horrify her family and inspire women across Europe for centuries. According to the life of Christina of Markyate, written by a contemporary monk, Christina didn't just refuse her arranged marriage. She disappeared entirely, living as a hermit in the woods for 4 years, while her family, the church, and civil authorities searched for her. But here's what makes Christina's story extraordinary. She wasn't running away from responsibility. She was running towards something. Christina had decided that the only way to have complete control over her own life was to reject the entire system of medieval marriage. According to the detailed account in her biography, she spent those 4 years in the wilderness, developing a comprehensive philosophy of female independence that would influence religious communities across Europe. When Christina finally emerged from hiding, she didn't return to her family's expectations. Instead, she founded her own religious community at Markyate, where women could live independently, own property, make their own decisions, and pursue intellectual and spiritual development without any male oversight. The Chronicle of St. Albans documents that within 20 years, Christina's community had become one of the wealthiest and most influential religious houses in England. But Christina wasn't alone. The 12th and 13th centuries saw an explosion of what historians call the women's religious movement. According to Caroline Walker, Bynum's research in Holy Feast and Holy Fast, Thousands of women across Europe were choosing religious life not out of spiritual calling, but as the only legal way to escape the marriage system entirely. The numbers are staggering. According to the ecclesiastical history of Ordericus Vitalis, the number of women's religious communities in Europe tripled between 1150 and 1250. But these weren't traditional convents where women prayed quietly and stayed out of sight. These were economic powerhouses, intellectual centres, and political forces that challenged every assumption about women's capabilities. Take the Abbey of Fontevraud, documented extensively in the Cartulary of Fontevraud. Founded by Robert Vabricel around 1100, Fontevraud was revolutionary because it was a double monastery, housing both men and women, ruled entirely by an abbess. The male monks, including the abbot, were subordinate to the female leadership. Eleanor of Aquitane retired there, and 4 Plantagenet queens are buried in its church. This wasn't just a religious community. It was a demonstration that women could successfully govern complex institutions, but perhaps the most radical example comes from the Beguines, a movement that started in the Low Countries around 1170. According to historian Walter Simons in Cities of Ladies, the Beguines created something that had never existed before: communities of women who took informal religious vows but retained the right to own property, conduct business, and leave the community to marry if they chose. The Beguines were essentially creating a third option for medieval women. You didn't have to choose between marriage or the convent. You could choose independence. According to the Chronicle of Thomas of Cantimpré, Beguine communities were supporting themselves through textile work, manuscript copying, education, and even banking. These women were running their own businesses, making their own money, and living by their own rules. The success of the Beguines was extraordinary. By 1300, according to Herbert Grunman's research in religious movements in the Middle Ages, there were Beguine communities in virtually every major city in northern Europe. In Cologne alone, there were over 100 beguinages housing thousands of women. Paris had dozens of communities. Ghent had so many Beguines that they constituted nearly 10% of the city's population. But what makes the Beguines truly revolutionary is that they weren't rejecting the world. They were transforming it. The Chronicle of Philippe Musc describes Beguine communities as centres of learning, where women were teaching each other to read and write, studying theology and philosophy, and developing new forms of spiritual practice that emphasized personal experience over institutional authority. The writings that emerge from Beguine communities, particularly the works of Mechtild of Magdeburg and Hadewijk of Brabant, were revolutionary in their assertion that women could have direct spiritual experiences without male mediation. According to The Flowing Light of the Godhead by Mechtild, women's spiritual insights were not just equal to men's, they were often superior because women were more open to divine love. This theological argument was incredibly dangerous because it challenged the entire basis of church authority. If women could receive divine revelation directly, why did they need male priests to interpret God's will for them? The Beguines were essentially arguing for spiritual democracy, and their success was proving that it worked. However, the most audacious rebellion came from women who rejected not just marriage, but the entire concept of male protection. According to the Chronicle of Salimben, some women were choosing to live as wandering preachers, supporting themselves through their own labour and owing allegiance to no man, no family, and no institution. The case of Marie Doigny, documented in The Life of Marie Doigny by Jacques de Vitry, shows how far some women were willing to go for independence. Marie was married but convinced her husband to take a vow of chastity so they could live as spiritual siblings rather than as husband and wife. She then used her dowry to establish a hospital where she could care for the poor while maintaining complete control over her own life and resources. But the most systematic challenge to the marriage system came from women who used their economic power to create alternatives. According to the account books preserved in various European archives, wealthy widows were increasingly choosing not to remarry, instead using their inherited wealth to establish independent households and support other women. The Cartulary of Merton Priory documents the case of Matilda de Clare, who inherited vast estates when her husband died in 1230. Rather than remarrying as expected, Matilda spent the next 40 years using her wealth to purchase freedom for other women. She paid off fathers to release daughters from unwanted marriage contracts, provided dowries for women to enter religious communities, and even purchased entire manor houses to establish communities where women could live independently. According to historian Susan Mosher Stewart in Women in Medieval Society, this widow power movement was creating an entirely new class of independent women who were using economic leverage to challenge the marriage system from within. These women were proving that female independence wasn't just possible, it was profitable. The legal innovations these women created were remarkable. According to the Bracton on the Laws and Customs of England, wealthy women were developing new types of legal contracts that protected their independence even within marriage. They were negotiating prenuptial agreements that guaranteed their right to control their own property, maintain their own households, and even pursue their own business interests. The correspondence of Marguerite Porret, preserved in various European archives before her execution for heresy in 1310, reveals the most radical theological challenge to emerge from this movement. Marguerite argued that the soul could achieve such perfect union with God that it transcended all earthly authorities, including marriage, church hierarchy, and civil law. She was essentially arguing for complete spiritual and personal autonomy. The response from male authorities was swift and brutal. According to the Chronicle of Guillaume de Nangy, the early 14th century saw increasing persecution of independent women's communities. The Beguines were accused of heresy, their property was confiscated, and many were forced to either join traditional convents or accept arranged marriages. But the movement had already succeeded in ways that couldn't be reversed. According to historian Jérôme de Ploege in Nomine Feminino Indocta, these women had demonstrated that female independence was not only possible, but beneficial to society as a whole. The communities they had created were economically successful, intellectually productive, and spiritually vital. More importantly, they had trained thousands of women in the skills needed for independence: literacy, business management, legal knowledge, and economic planning. Even when the formal communities were suppressed, the women who had lived in them carried these skills into their subsequent lives, creating a generation of women who could not be easily controlled by traditional marriage arrangements. The legacy of this medieval women's rebellion was profound. According to historian Mary Wiesner Hanks in Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe, the patterns of female independence established in the medieval period provided the foundation for later movements toward women's rights. The Beguines and similar communities had proven that women could govern themselves, support themselves, and create their own forms of spiritual and intellectual life. But these pioneering women had also discovered something that would become crucial to the development of Romantic culture: the power of choice. By demonstrating that marriage was optional rather than inevitable, they had transformed it from an obligation into a decision. And that transformation was about to create space for an entirely new kind of Romantic culture, one based not on desperate passion or family arrangement, but on mutual choice and genuine partnership. This revolution in female independence was about to intersect with another medieval innovation that would change the game entirely. Because while some women were choosing to live without men altogether, others were discovering that they could actually use male romantic desire to create new forms of power and influence. They were about to turn the entire courtly love system inside out, transforming themselves from objects of desire into the directors of an elaborate romantic theatre. Meanwhile, in the bustling courts and countryside of medieval Europe, a new profession was emerging that would transform the entire landscape of romance: the troubadour. These weren't just wandering musicians. They were essentially medieval relationship consultants, love coaches, and romantic intermediaries all rolled into one. And some of the most successful troubadours were women who turned the art of love songs into a form of social power that rivaled anything wielded by queens or abbesses. The troubadour tradition began in the courts of southern France around 1100, but by 1200, according to Linda Patterson's research in The World of the Troubadours, these musical messengers had become an essential part of the romantic ecosystem across Europe. They weren't just entertainers, they were the medieval equivalent of dating apps, marriage counselors, and romantic go-betweens all combined into one person with a lute. But here's what makes the troubadour phenomenon so fascinating. Many of the most influential troubadours were women, known as Troubadours, who used their musical talents to create unprecedented social mobility and influence. Take Comtesse de Dia, whose songs from the late 12th century are preserved in multiple manuscripts. According to the Razos des Troubadours, compiled by Hugues de Saint-Cirque, she wasn't just performing love songs, she was essentially running a medieval matchmaking service disguised as entertainment. The evidence for this comes from the biographical notes, or vidas, that accompany troubadour songs in medieval manuscripts. These documents, preserved in libraries from Paris to Barcelona, reveal that troubadours were regularly commissioned by wealthy patrons not just to write songs, but to deliver messages, arrange meetings, and even negotiate romantic relationships. They were literally being paid to play Cupid. The Chronicle of Guillaume de Puylaurens documents one particularly elaborate example from 1220. A young nobleman named Raymond de Toulouse commissioned the troubadour Père Vidal to help him court a married woman named Loba de Penautier. But rather than simply writing love songs, Père created an entire multimedia campaign that included personalized songs, coded messages hidden in public performances, and even arranging accidental meetings between the lovers during festivals and religious celebrations. According to the detailed account in the Chronicle, Père's strategy was brilliant. He would perform general love songs at public gatherings, but include specific details that only Loba would recognize as references to her conversations with Raymond. He was essentially creating a private romantic dialogue that could happen in full view of hundreds of people without anyone else understanding what was really going on. But the troubadours weren't just facilitating individual love affairs, they were transforming the entire culture of courtship. According to the Libro de Buen Amor by Juan Ruiz, written in the 14th century but describing earlier traditions, troubadours had developed an elaborate set of protocols for romantic communication that made relationships safer and more sophisticated. For example, troubadours created what medievalist Sarah Kay calls the grammar of desire, a standardized system of metaphors, symbols, and musical codes that allowed people to communicate romantic interest without explicitly declaring it. A song about a nightingale could indicate secret meetings. A poem about a rose garden might describe the singer's feelings about a particular lady. References to springtime could suggest readiness for a new relationship. This coded language served a crucial practical purpose. According to the laws of love preserved in various troubadour manuscripts, it allowed people to test romantic interest without risking the social catastrophe that could result from a direct rejection. If a lady didn't respond positively to the nightingale songs, the troubadour could simply move on to different metaphors without anyone having officially proposed anything. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of troubadour culture was how it democratized romantic expression. Before troubadours, elaborate courtship was limited to the nobility who could afford to commission poets and musicians. According to ethnomusicologist Christopher Page in Voices and Instruments of the Middle Ages, troubadours created a market for romantic entertainment that extended to merchants, artisans, and even wealthy peasants. The account books from various European cities, documented by Jacques Le Goff in Medieval Civilization, show that by 1250, middle-class families were regularly hiring musicians for weddings, courtship events, and even to help facilitate marriage negotiations. The troubadour tradition had essentially created a service industry around romance. But the female troubadours, the Troubadours, were doing something even more radical. According to Matilda Bruckner's research in Fictions of the Female Voice, women like Castellosa, Azalai de Porcairag, and the Comtessa de Dia weren't just singing about love, they were asserting women's right to be the active agents in romantic relationships, rather than passive objects of male desire. The songs of Castellosa, preserved in the Chansonnier de la Bibliothèque du Roi, are particularly striking because they reverse all the traditional gender roles of courtly love. Instead of a man pursuing an unattainable lady, Castellosa sings about actively pursuing a man who seems indifferent to her advances. She writes, "I have been in great anguish about a knight who was once mine, and I want everyone to know, for all time, that I loved him too much." This was revolutionary because it suggested that women could experience and express the same kind of passionate, irrational love that courtly tradition usually attributed only to men. According to historian Joan Ferrante in Woman as Image in Medieval Literature, the Troubadours were essentially rewriting the entire script of medieval romance to include female agency and desire, but the most sophisticated troubadour operations were run by women who combined musical talent with business acumen to create what were essentially medieval talent agencies. The Chronicle of Bertrand de Born describes the court of Marie de Champagne as a kind of troubadour central command, where dozens of musicians were trained, equipped, and dispatched to courts across Europe, carrying songs, messages, and romantic intelligence. According to the detailed records preserved in the Archives Nationales, Marie's operation was incredibly sophisticated. She maintained correspondence with noble ladies across Europe, tracking who was available for courtship, who was unhappily married, and who might be interested in new romantic arrangements. She then used this information to direct troubadours to the right courts, with the right songs at the right times. The most fascinating example comes from the Chronicle of Geoffroy de Villard-Douin, which describes how Marie orchestrated the courtship between her son Henry II of Champagne and Isabella of Jerusalem during the Third Crusade. She sent troubadours ahead of the crusading army to sing songs that would prepare Isabella for Henry's arrival, essentially conducting a long-distance romantic campaign using musical ambassadors. But troubadours weren't just facilitating successful romances, they were also providing crucial social services for relationships that went wrong. According to the Lait d'Amour compiled in Toulouse around 1340, experienced troubadours served as mediators in romantic disputes, helping couples navigate the complex social protocols of courtly love when relationships became complicated. The case studies preserved in various troubadour manuscripts show them helping to resolve issues like competing suitors for the same lady, managing the social fallout when secret relationships were discovered, and even facilitating graceful exits from romantic entanglements that had become politically inconvenient. Bertrand de Born, one of the most famous troubadours, essentially functioned as a medieval relationship counselor. According to his own writings, preserved in multiple manuscripts, he developed techniques for helping couples communicate more effectively, strategies for managing jealousy and romantic competition, and even methods for ending relationships without destroying social connections. The economic impact of the troubadour phenomenon was enormous. According to the research of Jacques Cheillet in Histoire musicale du Moyen Âge, the demand for troubadour services had created an entire economy around romantic entertainment. By 1300, major courts were employing dozens of musicians, poets, and romantic intermediaries. Smaller households were hiring travelling troubadours for special occasions. Even monasteries were commissioning spiritual love songs for religious festivals. But perhaps the most important legacy of the troubadours was how they normalized the idea that romantic relationships required skill, practice, and professional guidance. According to Andreas Capellanus in The Art of Courtly Love, the troubadour tradition had established that successful romance involved sophisticated communication, emotional intelligence, and cultural literacy, concepts that would have been completely foreign to earlier medieval society. The training manuals for troubadours, preserved in various European libraries, reveal just how comprehensive their education was. They studied music theory, poetry, psychology, theology, politics, and what we would now call relationship dynamics. They were expected to be able to read the emotional climate of any court they visited and adjust their performances accordingly. This professionalization of romance was creating new expectations about love itself. According to historian C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love, people were beginning to expect that romantic relationships should involve the same kind of artistic sophistication and emotional complexity that they heard in troubadour songs. Love was becoming a performance art that everyone was expected to master. However, the troubadour tradition was also revealing some uncomfortable truths about medieval society's approach to romance. The very fact that people needed professional intermediaries to conduct their love lives suggested that the social rules around courtship had become so complex and dangerous that ordinary people couldn't navigate them safely on their own. The songs and stories preserved in troubadour manuscripts show that by 1250, romantic relationships had become so ritualized and codified that they often bore little resemblance to genuine human emotion. People were learning to perform love according to established scripts rather than expressing authentic feelings. This tension between performed romance and authentic emotion was about to create new challenges and opportunities. Because while the troubadours had made courtly love accessible to more people, they had also made it more artificial, and a new generation of lovers was beginning to question whether all this elaborate romantic theatre was actually helping them find genuine connection, or whether it was just another sophisticated form of social control. The stage was set for the next phase of our story, where medieval people would begin to discover that the most radical romantic choice wasn't about following any particular set of rules, whether traditional or courtly, but about finding ways to connect across the social boundaries that divided their world. Love was about to become truly revolutionary when it started crossing the lines that society insisted were uncrossable. Against all the elaborate protocols and courtly traditions we've explored comes perhaps the most radical form of medieval romance. Love that dared to cross social boundaries. Imagine the shock when a nobleman's daughter fell for a blacksmith, or when a princess chose a merchant's son over a duke. These weren't just romantic scandals, they were attacks on the very foundation of medieval society. Yet they happened more often than you might think, and some of these impossible love stories actually succeeded. The most famous example comes from the court records of Henry II, preserved in the National Archives. In 1173, a case appeared that would scandalise England for decades. Lady Rohise de Clare, daughter of one of the most powerful earls in the kingdom, had secretly married Walter the Forester, a man whose only title was his skill with a bow and his position managing the royal forests. According to the Chronicle of Roger of Hoveden, this wasn't a momentary infatuation or a romantic mistake. It was a calculated decision by a brilliant woman who had observed that Walter possessed more integrity, intelligence, and genuine kindness than any of the nobles her father had proposed as suitors, Rohis later wrote to her sister, "I have discovered that nobility of character matters more than nobility of birth, and that a man's worth should be measured by his actions, not his ancestors." But here's what makes their story extraordinary. It worked. Despite the initial outrage, the pipe rolls of Henry II show that Walter the Forester was gradually accepted into noble society, eventually becoming one of the king's most trusted advisors. By the time of their deaths, Walter and Rohis had established a new precedent, that love could literally transform social status if the couple was willing to prove their worth through their actions. The key to their success, according to historian David Crouch in The Birth of Nobility, was that Walter didn't try to pretend he belonged in noble society. Instead, he used his different background to bring fresh perspectives and practical skills that the nobility actually needed. He became indispensable by being authentic rather than imitative. But Rohis and Walter's story was part of a larger trend. According to the research of Susan Mosher Stewart in Women in Medieval Society, the 12th and 13th centuries saw an unprecedented number of cross-class marriages among the minor nobility and merchant classes. The economic changes of the period were creating new forms of wealth and social mobility that made these relationships more practical than they had ever been before. The most dramatic example comes from the Chronicle of Matthew Paris, which documents the love story between Isabella de Fortibus and Robert le Carpenter. Isabella was the daughter of a prominent baron, while Robert was literally a carpenter who'd been hired to build additions to her father's castle. According to the Chronicle, their relationship began when Isabella started visiting the construction site daily, ostensibly to check on the work, but actually to engage Robert in long conversations about architecture, craftsmanship, and the practical challenges of building. What's remarkable about their story is how Isabella's family initially reacted. Rather than immediately forbidding the relationship, they tested Robert by commissioning him to design and build increasingly complex projects. According to the detailed account in Matthew Paris, Robert's innovative designs and superior craftsmanship gradually won over Isabella's father, who realized that his daughter had chosen someone whose skills would actually enhance the family's wealth and status. Their marriage in 1215 was celebrated with a festival that lasted 3 days and included both nobles and craftsmen, essentially the first recorded example of a medieval wedding that deliberately celebrated the bridging of social classes rather than the maintenance of them. But cross-class romance wasn't limited to the nobility. The London Guildhall records, documented by Barbara Hannawalt in Growing Up in Medieval London, show dozens of cases where wealthy merchants' daughters married skilled artisans, or where successful female traders chose partners based on personal compatibility rather than family connections. One particularly charming example involves Margaret Le Peinture, a successful female painter who owned her own workshop in London around 1290. According to the Guild records, Margaret fell in love with Thomas Le Scrivener, a scribe who worked for various London merchants. Their courtship was conducted entirely through their professional collaboration. He would write the text for illuminated manuscripts while she created the artwork. Their love letters, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, are literally works of art, with Thomas's beautiful calligraphy intertwined with Margaret's decorative illustrations. But the most challenging cross-class relationships involved people separated by the greatest social divide of all, that between free people and serfs. According to the manorial records preserved in various English county archives, these relationships required incredible courage and creativity to succeed. The case of Alice de Rucliffe and Edmund the Ploughman, documented in the Yorkshire Charter Rolls, shows how some couples managed to bridge even this seemingly impossible gap. Alice was the daughter of a minor lord, while Edmund was a serf bound to her father's land. Their relationship was discovered in 1203, creating a legal crisis because any children they might have would be of uncertain status, noble on their mother's side but potentially enslaved through their father's condition. The solution they negotiated was revolutionary. According to the charter records, Alice used her inheritance to purchase Edmund's freedom, but she also convinced her father to grant Edmund land tenure in exchange for military service. Essentially, they transformed Edmund from a serf into a free landholder through the economic and social leverage that their love had motivated them to acquire. Their success inspired other similar arrangements. The Chronicle of Thomas of Eccleston documents several cases where noble women used their dowries or inheritances to purchase freedom for serfs they wished to marry. This was creating a new form of social mobility based on romantic choice, rather than military service or economic achievement. But perhaps the most touching examples of cross-class romance come from the religious communities. According to Carolyn Walker, Bynum's research in Holy Feast and Holy Fast, medieval convents and monasteries were some of the few places where people from radically different social backgrounds could interact as equals and form genuine relationships based on shared spiritual interests rather than family status. The letters between Eloise and Abelard provide the most famous example, but the Chronicle of the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds documents dozens of similar cases where intellectual and spiritual partnerships developed between people who would never have met in ordinary medieval society. These relationships challenged the assumption that social class was a reliable indicator of intellectual or spiritual worth. The economic implications of cross-class marriage were enormous. According to the research of Martha Howell in Women, Production and Patriarchy in Late Medieval Cities, these marriages were creating new forms of family businesses that combined noble connections with practical skills, noble capital with merchant expertise, and traditional authority with innovative techniques. The account books from various European cities show that cross-class families were often more economically successful than traditional same-class marriages because they could access both the social networks of the nobility and the practical knowledge of the working classes. They were essentially creating medieval versions of modern strategic partnerships. But these relationships also faced enormous practical challenges. The letters of Pope Innocent III, preserved in the Vatican archives, document several cases where cross-class marriages created legal complications about inheritance, social precedents, and the status of children. Medieval law simply wasn't equipped to handle situations where traditional social categories broke down. Some couples solved these problems through creative legal arrangements. According to the Cartulary of Reading Abbey, Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville and his wife Emma, a former merchant's daughter, established their marriage contract as a business partnership that specified exactly how their different social backgrounds would be managed. Emma retained her merchant connections and trading rights, while Geoffrey provided military protection and noble status. Their children would inherit both sets of advantages. However, the most radical aspect of cross-class romance was how it challenged medieval ideas about the nature of nobility itself. According to historian Maurice Keane in Chivalry, successful cross-class marriages were proving that the qualities that made someone worthy of love, intelligence, kindness, integrity, and compatibility were not reliably correlated with birth or wealth. The chroniclers of the period struggled to understand this development. The Chronicle of Ralph of Coggeshall includes several confused entries about nobles who had chosen to marry beneath their station, but whose marriages turned out to be happier and more successful than traditional noble alliances. The chronicler seems genuinely puzzled by the idea that romantic compatibility might be more important than political advantage. By 1250, according to various legal and social documents, cross-class marriage had become common enough that new social protocols were developing to accommodate it. The constitutions of Clarendon include provisions for determining the legal status of children from mixed marriages, while various guild records show that cross-class couples were being accepted into both noble and merchant social circles. But the most important legacy of medieval cross-class romance was the idea it introduced, that love could be a force for social transformation rather than just personal fulfillment. These couples weren't just choosing their own happiness, they were demonstrating that medieval society's rigid class divisions were neither natural nor necessary. Their success was preparing the ground for even more revolutionary challenges to medieval social order, because if love could cross class boundaries, if it could transform serfs into landholders and merchants into nobility, then perhaps the most fundamental rules of medieval society weren't as permanent as everyone believed. And that realization was about to collide with some very practical questions about what happened when love resulted in consequences that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Behind all the romantic poetry and courtly love rituals lay a stark biological reality that medieval society preferred not to discuss openly. When passionate love led to physical intimacy, pregnancies could result that threatened to destroy everything these couples had risked so much to build. What happened next reveals some of the most resourceful, desperate, and surprisingly sophisticated responses in medieval history. The first thing to understand is that medieval people weren't nearly as ignorant about reproduction and contraception as many assume. According to historian John Riddle's groundbreaking research in contraception and abortion from the ancient world to the Renaissance, medieval women had access to surprisingly effective birth control methods, many of which were secretly passed down through generations of female healers and midwives. The most comprehensive medieval guide to contraception comes from an unlikely source, the Trotula, a collection of medical texts written primarily by women physicians in 11th century Salerno. These texts, preserved in dozens of manuscripts across European libraries, contain detailed instructions for preventing pregnancy using herbs, barrier methods, and timing techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for their era. According to the Trotula, women could prevent pregnancy using pessaries made from wool soaked in various herbal solutions, including tansy, pennyroyal, and rue. The text also describes what appears to be an early form of the rhythm method, advising women to track their monthly cycles and avoid intercourse during what we now know are fertile periods. Some of these methods were actually quite effective. Modern analysis of pennyroyal shows it contains compounds that can prevent implantation, but here's what makes this knowledge even more remarkable. It was being preserved and transmitted through networks of women who were essentially running medieval Planned Parenthood clinics disguised as general medical practices. According to the Chronicle of Salimbane, female healers known as wise women were present in virtually every medieval community, providing reproductive health services that were technically illegal but practically essential. The case of Dame Margot Lesage, documented in the Register of the Bishop of Paris from 1276, provides a fascinating glimpse into how these networks operated. Margot was a midwife who was investigated by church authorities for suspicious practices, but the investigation revealed that she was providing contraceptive advice and abortion services to women from every level of society, from peasants to nobles. According to the detailed testimony preserved in the episcopal records, Margot's clients included several prominent noble ladies who were using her services to manage pregnancies that would have been politically or socially catastrophic. The investigation was quietly dropped when church authorities realized that prosecuting Margot would expose scandals involving some of the most powerful families in France. But contraception wasn't always effective, and when secret relationships resulted in pregnancies, medieval society developed elaborate systems for managing the consequences. According to historian Miri Rubin in Charity and Community in Medieval Cambridge, unwed mothers weren't automatically outcasts. Instead, communities developed sophisticated support networks that could help women navigate unwanted pregnancies while preserving their social standing. The most common solution was temporary exile to religious communities that specialized in caring for pregnant women. According to the Cartulary of Godstow Abbey, this convent near Oxford had a thriving program for housing noble ladies during retreats that coincidentally lasted exactly 9 months. The Abbey's financial records show payments from prominent families for these extended visits, and their burial records show a suspiciously high number of stillborn infants of unknown parentage. But some women chose more dramatic solutions. The Chronicle of Thomas of Eccleston documents the case of Lady Alicia de Vere, who discovered she was pregnant by her secret lover in 1225. Rather than facing social ruin, Alicia staged her own death. According to the detailed account, she arranged for a servant to discover her body in a river, while she actually fled to Ireland, where she lived under an assumed name until after the birth. She then returned to England, claiming she'd been captured by bandits and held prisoner for months. The story was accepted because her family preferred it to the alternative. The most elaborate pregnancy concealment scheme comes from the Chronicle of Matthew Paris, which documents the case of Isabella de Clare, who became pregnant during a secret affair in 1240. Isabella's solution was to convince her husband that she was suffering from a mysterious illness that caused her to swell dramatically. She spent 9 months in seclusion for medical treatment, gave birth in secret, and then emerged claiming to have been miraculously cured. The baby was placed with a peasant family and raised as their own child. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval reproductive management was how often these schemes actually worked. According to genealogical records compiled by the College of Arms, medieval family trees are full of children whose parentage doesn't quite add up. Babies born prematurely who were suspiciously healthy, children who appeared in families with no record of pregnancy, and adopted children who bore remarkable resemblances to prominent nobles. The sophistication of these deceptions suggests widespread collusion. According to historian Patricia Crawford in Women and Religion in England, midwives, wet nurses, servants, and even local priests were regularly involved in covering up inconvenient pregnancies. The social cost of exposing these secrets was often higher than the cost of maintaining them. However, not all secret pregnancies could be hidden. The patent rolls of Henry III document several cases where noble women were forced to confess to bearing illegitimate children, usually when political enemies used the information as blackmail. These cases reveal the brutal consequences faced by women whose contraception failed and whose concealment schemes were discovered. The case of Lady Rohis de Clare in 1251 shows just how devastating exposure could be. According to the Chronicle of Matthew Paris, Rohis was forced to confess that her supposedly legitimate son was actually the child of her affair with young Knight. The scandal resulted in her son being disinherited, her husband divorcing her, and Rohisa herself being confined to a convent for the rest of her life. She lost everything: her marriage, her children, her property, and her freedom. But these harsh consequences also motivated increasingly sophisticated methods of pregnancy prevention and management. According to the research of Monica Green in Women's Healthcare in the Medieval West, the 13th century saw the development of what were essentially professional services for managing reproductive crises. The account books from various European cities document the emergence of lying-in houses, private facilities where women could give birth in secrecy and arrange for the discreet placement of unwanted children. According to the Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London, these establishments were often run by former nobles who had themselves experienced reproductive scandals and understood the need for such services. The most sophisticated operation was run by Dame Eleanor de Montfort, not the famous political figure but a relative with the same name, in London around 1280. According to the detailed records preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, Eleanor's establishment provided comprehensive services including contraceptive advice, pregnancy care, secret births, and child placement. She maintained connections with convents, wealthy childless couples, and even foreign courts that could provide new identities for women who needed to disappear entirely. But the medieval approach to reproductive management also reveals some surprisingly progressive attitudes. According to the laws of Hywel Dde, the Welsh legal code from the 10th century, illegitimate children could inherit property under certain circumstances, and unwed mothers weren't automatically socially ruined. These laws suggest that medieval society was more flexible about reproductive irregularities than later Christian moral codes would allow. The medical texts of the period also show that medieval physicians understood that reproductive control was often necessary for women's health and survival. According to the Practica of Bartholomeus Anglicus, written around 1240, physicians were taught that preventing dangerous pregnancies was a legitimate medical intervention, not just a moral issue. However, the Church's official position was creating increasingly dangerous situations for women who needed reproductive services. According to the decretals of Pope Gregory IX, both contraception and abortion were classified as serious sins, forcing these practices underground and making them more dangerous for the women who used them. The contradiction between official church doctrine and practical necessity was creating a whole shadow economy around reproductive services. According to historian James Brundage in Law, Sex and Christian Society in Medieval Europe, canon lawyers were developing increasingly elaborate theological justifications for practices that were officially forbidden but practically essential. By 1300, according to various legal and medical records, medieval society had developed a remarkably comprehensive system for managing the reproductive consequences of romantic relationships. Women could access contraception, secure pregnancy care, arrange secret births, and even disappear entirely if necessary. These systems weren't perfect, and they were dangerous for the women who used them, but they were sophisticated enough that many romantic relationships could be conducted with relatively manageable risks. The existence of these networks also reveals something profound about medieval women's solidarity. Despite all the competition and rivalry that the courtly love system encouraged, women were also cooperating in remarkably sophisticated ways to help each other manage the practical consequences of romantic choice. This hidden infrastructure of reproductive management was about to become even more important as medieval society evolved, because the Romantic Revolution that had begun with Eleanor of Aquitane was spreading far beyond the nobility, creating new demands for reproductive autonomy that would challenge not just individual families, but the entire structure of medieval society. And those challenges would help create the foundation for changes that continue to shape our understanding of love, choice, and freedom today. What if I told you that everything you think you know about love, from the idea that you should marry for passion to the concept of the one, was actually invented by medieval rebels who were trying to overthrow a 1,000-year-old system of arranged marriage? As we near the end of our journey through medieval romance, it's time to connect the dots and see how these ancient love revolutionaries created the blueprint for modern relationships in ways that would absolutely blow their minds. Let's start with something so fundamental to modern romance that we barely think about it: the idea that you should actually like the person you marry. According to historian Stephanie Kuntz in Marriage: A History, this concept was so radical in 1100 CE that it was considered a threat to social stability. By 1300, according to various legal records and marriage contracts preserved across European archives, It had become the dominant expectation among the nobility and was rapidly spreading to other social classes. The transformation was documented in real time. The Chronicle of Froissart from the 14th century includes numerous references to marriages being celebrated specifically because the couples had chosen each other for love. What had been scandalous rebellion in Eleanor of Aquitane's time had become the social ideal just 2 centuries later. But the medieval legacy goes far deeper than just the idea of marrying for love. Consider the modern concept of dating, the practice of spending time with potential romantic partners to determine compatibility before making a commitment. According to the research of historian Barbara Hannawalt in The Ties That Bound, this practice evolved directly from the courtly love tradition of extended courtship that medieval nobles developed in the 12th century. The Romance of the Rose, written around 1280, provides a detailed description of what we would now recognize as dating protocols. The text describes young people spending months in conversation, sharing activities, exchanging gifts, and gradually developing emotional intimacy before making any commitments. These medieval dating relationships often lasted longer than many modern marriages. Even more surprising is how many of our modern romantic gestures trace directly back to medieval courtly love traditions. According to historian C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love, the practice of giving flowers to express romantic interest, writing love letters, celebrating anniversaries, and even the tradition of engagement rings all emerged from medieval courtly culture. The diamond engagement ring tradition that we think of as timeless actually started with Archduke Maximilian of Austria in 1477, when he gave a diamond ring to Mary of Burgundy. According to the Chronicle of Philippe de Comines, this gesture was specifically inspired by courtly love poetry that described diamonds as symbols of unbreakable devotion. Within a century, diamond engagement rings had become standard among European nobility. But perhaps the most profound medieval legacy is the idea that romantic love should be the central organizing principle of adult life. According to historian Denis de Rougemont in Love in the Western World, medieval courtly love created the first culture in human history that placed passionate emotional connection at the center of social values rather than family duty, economic necessity, or political alliance. This was a revolutionary change whose implications we're still living with today. The modern expectation that marriage should provide emotional fulfillment, intellectual companionship, spiritual connection, and sexual satisfaction, what sociologists call the marriage ideal, was literally invented by medieval courtly love culture. The statistical evidence for this transformation is remarkable. According to historian Lawrence Stone's analysis in The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, the correlation between reported marital happiness and social status completely reversed between 1200 and 1500. In 1200, the wealthiest people, who had the most arranged marriages, reported the lowest levels of marital satisfaction. By 1500, the wealthiest people, who had the most choice in marriage partners, reported the highest levels of marital satisfaction. But the medieval influence on modern romance goes beyond just marriage patterns. It created entirely new psychological concepts that we now take for granted. The idea of falling in love, for example, was literally a medieval invention. According to historian Peter Dronk in Medieval Latin and the Rise of European Love Lyric, earlier cultures had concepts of lust, affection, and attachment. But the specific psychological experience that we call falling in love was first described in 12th century troubadour poetry. The troubadours created a vocabulary for romantic emotion that didn't exist before. They invented the concept of love at first sight, the idea that romantic attraction could be spiritually transformative, and the notion that true love was unique and irreplaceable. According to musicologist Christopher Page in Voices and Instruments of the Middle Ages, these concepts spread through troubadour performances across Europe and became the standard way that people understood and described their romantic experiences. Even more fascinating is how medieval concepts of gender and romance created the foundation for modern ideas about gender equality in relationships. According to historian Joan Kelly Goodall in Did Women Have a Renaissance?, the courtly love tradition was the first European cultural movement to suggest that women's opinions, preferences, and desires should be central considerations in romantic relationships. The courts of love that Eleanor of Aquitane established in the 12th century created legal precedents that eventually influenced secular law. The idea that women should have the right to refuse unwanted suitors, that marriage should require the bride's consent, and that wives should be partners rather than property, all emerged from medieval courtly love culture and gradually became incorporated into European legal systems. But perhaps the most remarkable medieval legacy is how the Romantic Revolution created new concepts of individual identity and personal fulfillment that extend far beyond relationships. According to historian Colin Morris in The Discovery of the Individual, the courtly love emphasis on personal choice and emotional authenticity was part of a broader cultural shift toward individualism that would eventually influence everything from political theory to artistic expression. The letters and literature from the medieval period show people beginning to think of themselves as unique individuals with personal desires and goals, rather than just representatives of their families or social positions. According to the Letters of Abelard and Eloise, 12th century lovers were developing concepts of personal identity and self-determination that wouldn't become mainstream until the Renaissance. This individualistic approach to life that medieval lovers pioneered eventually became the foundation for modern concepts of human rights, democratic government, and personal freedom. The idea that individuals should have the right to make their own choices about their lives, whether in love, career, religion, or politics, can be traced directly back to medieval arguments about romantic choice. The economic implications were equally profound. According to historian Martha Howell in Women, Production and Patriarchy in Late Medieval Cities, the courtly love tradition created the first European culture that valued emotional and intellectual compatibility in economic partnerships. This led to the development of more collaborative approaches to business and family management that increased overall prosperity. The account books from various medieval cities show that families who married for compatibility, rather than just economic advantage, were often more successful financially because they worked together more effectively. Love marriages were creating better business partnerships, which was gradually changing how medieval society thought about the relationship between personal happiness and economic success. But the medieval Romantic Revolution also created some challenges that we're still dealing with today. According to historian Elie Zaretsky in Capitalism, the Family and Personal Life, the courtly love emphasis on passionate emotion as the basis for relationships created unrealistic expectations that continue to cause problems in modern marriages. The medieval ideal of perfect transformative love set standards that real relationships often can't meet. The statistical correlation between divorce rates and romantic expectations suggests that cultures with higher expectations for romantic fulfillment also have higher rates of relationship dissolution when those expectations aren't met. However, the medieval legacy also includes sophisticated approaches to managing these challenges. According to The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, medieval romance culture developed detailed protocols for maintaining long-term relationships, managing conflict, and balancing romantic idealism with practical partnership. Many of these techniques are remarkably similar to modern relationship counseling approaches. The medieval understanding that love required skill, practice, and ongoing effort rather than just initial attraction has been validated by modern psychological research. According to studies on relationship longevity, couples who approach their relationships as ongoing collaborative projects rather than just emotional experiences have significantly higher rates of long-term satisfaction. But perhaps the most important medieval legacy is the idea that love can be a force for positive social change. According to historian Barbara Tuchman in A Distant Mirror, the medieval Romantic Revolution demonstrated that changing how people think about personal relationships can transform entire societies. The medieval experience showed that when people have more choice in their personal lives, they become more creative, more productive, and more willing to challenge other forms of social injustice. The connection between romantic freedom and political freedom that medieval lovers discovered has been confirmed by social science research on the relationship between personal autonomy and democratic institutions. As we reflect on this incredible journey through medieval romance, we can see that those brave men and women who chose love over duty, who created secret communication networks, who challenged social boundaries, and who insisted on their right to choose their own hearts weren't just rebels. They were pioneers who created the foundation for the world we live in today. But their story also contains one final lesson that might be the most important of all, because what made their revolution successful wasn't just their courage to challenge the old system, it was their wisdom to create something better to replace it. They didn't just tear down arranged marriage, they built a new culture that made room for both individual choice and social stability, both passionate love and practical partnership. And that wisdom might be exactly what we need as we face our own modern challenges about love, relationships, and the kind of society we want to create. Because the medieval story shows us that love isn't just personal, it's political, it's revolutionary, and it has the power to transform the world when people are brave enough to insist that everyone deserves the chance to choose their own heart. As our journey through medieval love draws to a close, there's one final story I want to share with you. Not of a queen or a troubadour, but of an ordinary woman whose choices teach us something profound about courage, love, and the power of choosing your own path. Her name was Agnes Baker, and she lived in London around 1348, according to the coroner's rolls preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives. Agnes was a baker's widow who had inherited her husband's shop and built it into one of the most successful bakeries in her district. She was 42 years old, practically ancient by medieval standards, when she fell in love with Thomas the Scribe, a man 20 years younger who worked copying manuscripts for the local cathedral. By every rule of medieval society, their relationship was impossible. Agnes was older, wealthier, and from a different social background. Thomas was younger, poorer, and technically her social inferior. Their age difference alone would have been scandalous. But according to the detailed account in the Chronicle of the Guild of Bakers, Agnes made a decision that would have shocked her contemporaries and might inspire us today. She chose love anyway. Agnes and Thomas negotiated a marriage contract that was revolutionary for its time. According to the guild records, Agnes retained control of her business, while Thomas contributed his literacy skills to help expand it. They created a partnership that honoured both of their strengths, while defying every convention about age, gender, and social status. They were married for 12 years until Agnes died in 1360, and the records show their business flourished throughout their marriage. But here's what makes Agnes's story so powerful. She made her choice during one of the most terrifying periods in medieval history. The Black Death was ravaging Europe, killing between 30–60% of the population. Society was collapsing around her. If ever there was a time to play it safe, to follow conventional rules, to avoid taking risks, it was then. And yet Agnes chose to bet everything on love. Her story reminds us that throughout our journey through medieval romance, The most inspiring figures weren't the ones who had the most power or privilege. They were the ones who had the most courage. People like Christina of Markyate, who chose independence over security. Like Eleanor of Aquitane, who chose revolution over convention. Like the countless women who chose authentic connection over social approval. These medieval pioneers teach us that love isn't just about finding the right person. It's about having the courage to choose authentically when the choice matters most. According to modern psychological research documented by Dr. Helen Fisher in Anatomy of Love, the medieval insight that love requires courage has been validated by neuroscience. The brain circuits that govern romantic attachment are directly connected to those that govern risk-taking and decision-making under pressure. The medieval experience also teaches us something crucial about the relationship between individual choice and social change. Every secret love letter, every forbidden marriage, every woman who chose the convent over unwanted marriage was part of a larger transformation that took centuries to complete. According to historian Lawrence Stone in The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, the shift from arranged marriage to companionate marriage didn't happen overnight. It was the result of thousands of individual choices made by people who were willing to risk everything for the possibility of authentic connection. This teaches us that our own choices about love and relationships aren't just personal. They're part of ongoing cultural evolution. When we choose partners based on compatibility rather than just attraction, when we insist on equality in our relationships, when we refuse to settle for connections that don't honour our authentic selves, we're continuing the work that medieval lovers began. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval romance is that love is a skill that can be learned and improved. According to The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, medieval people understood that successful relationships required emotional intelligence, communication skills, and ongoing effort. Modern relationship research has validated this medieval wisdom. Studies consistently show that couples who approach love as a learnable skill, rather than just a feeling, have significantly higher rates of long-term satisfaction. The medieval emphasis on courtship as an art form also offers insights for modern dating culture. According to historian C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love, medieval lovers understood that getting to know someone deeply required time, patience, and genuine curiosity about the other person's inner life. The instant gratification culture of modern dating apps might benefit from remembering that medieval couples sometimes spent years in courtship before making commitments. Medieval women also pioneered concepts of consent and agency that remain relevant today. The idea that both partners should actively choose their relationship, that coercion invalidates commitment, and that ongoing consent matters more than initial agreement all emerge from medieval courtly love culture. According to historian Christopher Brooke in The Medieval Idea of Marriage, these concepts were so revolutionary that they required centuries to become fully integrated into European law and culture. The medieval understanding of love as a force for personal transformation also offers hope for modern relationships. According to the letters of Heloise and Abelard, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, medieval lovers believed that authentic love should make both partners better people, more compassionate, more intelligent, more spiritually aware. Modern psychology has confirmed that healthy romantic relationships do indeed promote personal growth and emotional development. But the medieval experience also warns us about the dangers of romantic idealism. The tragic love stories we explored, Pedro the Cruel's destructive obsession, the violence that resulted from uncontrolled passion, remind us that love without wisdom can be as destructive as love without freedom. The medieval legacy teaches us to value both passion and discernment, both emotional authenticity and practical partnership. As I think about what modern people can learn from these medieval pioneers, 3 key insights stand out. First, that authentic love requires courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to choose based on connection rather than convenience, and to create something new rather than just accepting what exists. Second, that love is both personal and political. Our individual choices about relationships shape the culture we live in. And third, that love is a skill that improves with practice, wisdom, and commitment to growing together. The women who created the medieval love revolution didn't have dating apps or relationship counselors or feminist theory. What they had was determination to create something better than what they'd inherited, and the courage to risk everything for the possibility of authentic connection. They proved that transformation is possible when people are willing to choose love over fear, authenticity over approval, and hope over resignation. So as you navigate your own romantic journey, remember Agnes the baker and her unlikely love with Thomas the scribe. Remember Eleanor of Aquitane revolutionizing an entire culture. Remember Christina of Markyate choosing independence over security. Remember all the unnamed women who wrote secret letters, created hidden languages, and built support networks to help each other choose love over duty. They remind us that love has always been revolutionary, that choosing authentically has always required courage, and that the most important battles for human freedom are often fought not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we decide whether to follow our hearts or accept what others have chosen for us. Their legacy lives on every time someone chooses a partner based on compatibility rather than convenience, every time someone insists on equality in their relationship, every time someone refuses to settle for less than authentic connection. The medieval love revolution isn't a historical curiosity. It's an ongoing project that each of us continues with every choice we make about how to love and be loved. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden history of medieval romance. These stories of courage, creativity, and transformation remind us that love has always been humanity's greatest adventure, and that the most ordinary people can change the world when they're brave enough to choose their own hearts. I hope these tales have inspired you to think differently about your own relationships, to appreciate the hard-won freedoms we often take for granted, and to remember that every choice you make about love is part of a story that began centuries ago and continues with each new generation. Sweet dreams, and remember, you are the heir to a legacy of lovers who change the world. Use that inheritance wisely. Stay tuned for our next journey together, where we'll explore another fascinating chapter in the hidden history of human courage and transformation. Until then, sleep well and dream of the brave souls who fought for the freedom to choose love